The warrant officer's voice cut like a blade through the Texas heat. "Ma'am, step back, now." Hannah Lewis didn't move. Couldn't move. Because 40 feet away sat her tank, her Desert Rose, dead and silent, while 6 certified engineers circled it like mourners at a wake. She knew exactly what was wrong. Could hear it in the way the turbine whined without catching. Could feel it in the wrongness of the idle. 1 wrench, 90 seconds. That's all it would take. But to this man, she was invisible. Just another civilian woman who didn't belong. Just someone to dismiss. He had no idea she'd commanded this beast through hell itself, or that his arrogance was about to cost him everything. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this journey travels. Hannah's thumb worked the challenge coin in her right pocket, the brass worn smooth from 1,000 anxious moments just like this one. The metal was warm, almost alive, and every rotation was a prayer she didn't know she was saying. "Run the diagnostic again," Warrant Officer Davis barked at his team. His voice carried that particular edge of a man who knew he was failing, but refused to admit why. "The FADEC system has to show us something. It has to." A specialist with grease-stained hands looked up from his tablet, exhaustion bleeding through every syllable. "Chief, we've run it 6 times. The full authority digital engine control says everything's green. Fuel pressure's nominal. Air intake's clear. Ignition sequence initializes perfectly. The turbine just won't catch." "Then run it again," Davis snapped. Hannah watched a bead of sweat roll down the specialist's temple. She knew that look, the hollow-eyed desperation of a good soldier being ordered to repeat a failed solution because his superior couldn't imagine any other path forward. The book said, run the diagnostic, so they'd run it until the sun went down, or the base commander's head exploded, whichever came first. The motor pool stretched out behind them, a football field of concrete and chain-link fence, baking under the merciless September heat. Other tanks sat in neat rows, their crews going through maintenance routines, with the rhythmic boredom of men who knew their machines would start when asked. But this one, the newest SEP V3 variant, with its upgraded armor and fire control systems, sat silent as a tombstone. Colonel Thorne paced near the command tent 50 yards away, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing with the sharp, aggressive movements of a man delivering very bad news to people who didn't want to hear it. Hannah didn't need to hear the conversation to know what he was saying. The foreign military observers were arriving in 90 minutes. The Secretary of Defense had personally approved this demonstration, and the crown jewel of American armored warfare looked like an overpriced lawn ornament. "Ma'am," the voice came from directly behind her, close enough to make her shoulders tense. "Ma'am, I need you to move behind the safety line." Hannah turned slowly. Davis stood there, his jaw set, his eyes broadcasting pure dismissal. He was young, maybe 32, 33, with the kind of sharp-featured face that looked like it had been assembled from straight lines and right angles. His name tape was perfectly aligned. His boots were mirror-bright despite the dust. Everything about him screamed by-the-book competence. "I'm fine here, Chief," she said quietly. "The safety line is clearly marked." He pointed to a strip of yellow paint 20 feet behind them. "Contractor personnel are not authorized in the immediate work area during technical recovery operations." "I'm not in anyone's way." His eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again." The challenge coin rotated. Once. Twice. Hannah's gaze drifted past Davis to the tank itself. She'd know that hull anywhere, the specific pattern of welds on the glacis plate, the small dent on the left track guard from a poorly executed pivot turn in Balad, the faint discoloration on the turret where reactive armor tiles had been replaced after taking an RPG hit that should have killed everyone inside. "That's Desert Rose," she said softly. Davis blinked. "What?" "The tank. Her name is Desert Rose." "All tanks have nicknames, ma'am." His tone suggested she'd just stated that water was wet. "It's still U.S. government property, and you still need to step back." Hannah's fingers closed around the coin. The memory hit without warning, vivid as a slap, the inside of that turret at night lit by red combat lights. The radio crackling with target coordinates, while her loader chambered around with practiced efficiency. The gunner's voice in her headset, target acquired. Her own response calm as ordering coffee. Fire. The whole chassis rocking back from the recoil, and then the satisfying bloom of fire in her thermal sight as an enemy position ceased to exist. "Chief Davis," she said, her voice still level, "did you check the secondary air filter seals?" He stared at her like she'd started speaking Mandarin. "The what?" "Behind the acoustic baffling. The secondary seals on the auxiliary air intake." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "Ma'am, that's a depot-level maintenance item. It's not on the field troubleshooting checklist." "I know it's not on the checklist." "Then why would we check it?" His voice rose half an octave. "We follow procedure here. We don't go tearing into engine components based on hunches from the peanut gallery." One of the younger soldiers, a private first class who couldn't have been more than 21, glanced up from where he was crawling under the tank's belly. His eyes moved between Hannah and Davis with the cautious attention of someone watching a small fire decide whether to spread. Hannah kept her voice soft. "How long have you been running training exercises?" "That's not relevant to." 3 weeks. 4. Davis's face was starting to flush. "We completed a full combat readiness cycle, standard protocol. In fine particle dust." "This is Texas, ma'am. Dust is a fact of life." "That dust," Hannah continued, still in that same quiet register that somehow cut through the motor pool noise, "is almost as fine as Iraqi sand. It gets past the primary gaskets if you don't rotate the filters every 72 hours instead of every week. The FADEC thinks it's getting enough air because the sensors are reading pressure differentials, but they're reading phantom data. The intake is choked, the engine's suffocating on false information." For 3 long seconds, Davis just stared at her. A radio squawked somewhere. A wrench clanged against concrete. The flag on the distant headquarters building snapped in a gust of hot wind. "Who are you?" he finally asked. "Someone who knows this tank." "You're a contractor," he said the word like it tasted bad. "Your badge says Simulation Center Access. You write computer programs." "Among other things." "You're telling me that my Team 5 certified armor support technicians with a combined 40 years of experience missed something? That our diagnostic systems, which cost more than your annual salary, are wrong? And you figured this out by what exactly? Vibes." The coin rotated. Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something that made her throat tighten. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of looking incompetent in front of his commander, terrified of admitting that the books and computers and procedures he'd built his entire identity around couldn't solve this problem. She'd known soldiers like him before, good ones, smart ones, trapped in the prison of their own rigidity. "Chief," she said gently, "I'm not trying to undermine you." "Then step back behind the line and let us work." A new voice cut across the motor pool, sharp as a whip crack. "Davis." Master Sergeant Reyes came walking up, his barrel chest preceding him like the prow of a ship. He was older than everyone else here by at least a decade, with iron gray hair buzzed down to stubble and eyes that looked like they'd seen the Army try every stupid thing twice. He stopped next to Davis, arms crossed, and his gaze went straight to Hannah. For a long moment, he just studied her. His eyes traveled from her face to her hands, still in her pockets, still working that coin to her boots, which weren't contractor clean, but worn and practical, the kind soldiers wore when they actually worked. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something like recognition flickered across his features. "Chief," Reyes said slowly, "who's this contractor Master Sergeant from the Simulation Center? She's been—" "I asked who she is, not what her badge says." Davis's mouth opened and closed. I don't know her name." Reyes turned to Hannah. "You served." It wasn't a question. Hannah met his eyes and saw instant understanding there, the kind that only comes from shared experience. "I did." "Where?" "Iraq, Afghanistan. Few other places that weren't on the news. MOS Cow, 19 Kilo, tank commander. Davis made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. The PFC under the tank had stopped moving, entirely frozen in place. Two other specialists had turned to stare. Reyes nodded slowly. How long? 15 years, active. And now you're here fixing simulators. The way he said it made clear what he thought of that particular career trajectory. Hannah shrugged. Pays the bills. Master Sergeant, Davis interjected, his voice tight. With all due respect, her background doesn't change the situation. We have protocol. We have procedures. We can't just what? Reyes's voice dropped into a register that made junior enlisted personnel instinctively stand straighter. Can't listen when someone with actual experience offers input. Can't consider that maybe, just maybe, the computer doesn't know everything. The diagnostic system has been wrong before. Reyes turned back to Hannah. You said something about secondary filters. She pulled one hand from her pocket, not the one holding the coin, and pointed at the tank's engine housing. The seals behind the acoustic baffling. If they've been running in dust like they have been, and if they haven't been rotating filters on an accelerated schedule, those seals are probably compromised. The sensors will read normal airflow because they're measuring differential pressure at the primary intake, but the actual volume of clean air reaching the turbine is insufficient for ignition sustainability. Davis's face had gone from red to an unhealthy gray. That's not in the troubleshooting sequence. I know. How do you know this is the problem? The coin was warm in her palm now, almost hot. Hannah closed her eyes for half a second and let the memory take her that same engine bay late at night in Faux B. Hammer Sergeant Casey's voice in her ear as he guided her hands through a similar repair. The AGT 1500 is a temperamental bitch, ma'am. She'll lie to you through every sensor she's got. You want to know what's really wrong, you gotta listen with your hands. She opened her eyes. Because I've fixed this exact problem 7 times. The motor pool had gone very quiet. Even the ambient noise seemed to have dropped away, leaving only the hum of distant generators and the whisper of wind across concrete. Davis looked like a man watching his religion collapse in real time. 7 times. In combat, Hannah added, where if you don't fix it, people die. Reyes's expression had shifted from respect to something approaching awe. What unit? Crazy Horse Company. 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. The PFC under the tank actually gasped. It was a small sound quickly stifled, but it carried. Reyes went very still. Even Davis, for all his resistance, seemed to recognize those words meant something important. You're Captain Lewis, Reyes said quietly. Hannah winced. Just Hannah now. I'm not an officer anymore. Jesus Christ, one of the specialists whispered. Davis looked between Reyes and Hannah, confusion and horror warring on his face. What am I missing? What's Crazy Horse Company? Reyes didn't take his eyes off Hannah. Crazy Horse Company holds the regimental record for operational readiness during sustained combat operations. 540 consecutive days without a single vehicle deadlined for maintenance. During the surge, in Anbar province. He paused. And this woman was their commander. The world tilted slightly. Hannah felt it tilt. She'd spent 5 years trying to be invisible, trying to be just another contractor, just another civilian who used to wear the uniform. And now, in the space of 30 seconds, that invisibility had been stripped away like paint under a sandblaster. There's more, Reyes continued, and his voice had taken on the quality of a man reciting scripture. Second Battle of Ramadi. Her tank took an IED hit that knocked out the main gun's traverse mechanism. She jury-rigged the actuator using a radio battery and commo wire while her position was under sustained enemy fire. Kept her crew fighting. Saved 3 other vehicles that were pinned down. Davis had gone completely silent. His tablet hung forgotten at his side. They put her up for the Silver Star, Reyes finished. She turned it down. Said her loader deserved it more. Hannah's jaw tightened. That's not how it happened. That's exactly how it happened, ma'am. I was at Campbell when the story made the rounds. Every maintenance NCO in the Army knows your name. New, Hannah corrected. Past tense. I've been out for 5 years. Doesn't matter. Reyes turned to Davis, and his voice carried an edge that could cut steel. Chief, you just spent the last hour telling Captain Lewis to stand behind the safety line while her own tank sat broken in front of her. The full weight of that statement hit Davis like a physical blow. His face went through several colors in rapid succession, red to white, to an awful greenish hue that suggested he might actually be sick. His hands started to shake. Not much, just enough to make the tablet screen shiver. He swallowed hard. I didn't. You didn't ask, Reyes said flatly. You saw a woman in contractor coveralls and decided she couldn't possibly know anything worth hearing. You want to tell me what that says about your judgment, Chief? The radio on Davis's hip crackled to life. All personnel, this is base command. Foreign delegation arrives in T-minus 75 minutes. Colonel Thorne wants status update on the Abrams situation immediately. Acknowledge. Nobody moved. The words hung in the air like an air raid siren. Davis grabbed the radio with trembling hands. Command, this is Motor Pool Actual. Status is... He couldn't finish the sentence. How do you tell a full-bird colonel that you're about to humiliate the United States Army in front of allied nations because you were too proud to listen to someone who actually knew what they were doing? Hannah watched him struggle, and something in her chest loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. She'd been where he was young, certain convinced that following the rules was the same as being right. It had taken blood and fire to burn that certainty out of her. Chief, she said quietly. He looked at her with the expression of a drowning man spotting a rope. Let me look at her, Hannah said. Just let me look. Davis opened his mouth, closed it. His hand tightened on the radio. Every second of silence was another degree of heat in Colonel Thorne's building fury. She won't bite, Hannah added. I promise. For a long suspended moment, the entire motor pool seemed to hold its breath. In the distance, a jet took off from the runway, its engines screaming. A car horn honked somewhere on base. Normal life continuing, indifferent to this small drama playing out over oil-stained concrete. Davis's shoulders sagged. Master Sergeant Reyes, you're the senior NCO here. It's your call. Reyes didn't hesitate. Ma'am, the tank is yours. Hannah pulled the challenge coin from her pocket, finally bringing it into the light. It caught the sun gleaming dull brass, worn smooth on both sides from years of nervous handling. Master Sergeant Casey's coin, given to her the day before he rotated home. The day before, she took full command of Desert Rose. She walked toward the tank, and the soldiers parted for her like water. Their faces were a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like hope. She heard whispers following her. That's Captain Lewis. Holy shit, it's actually her. The Ramadi thing is real. Hannah tuned them out. Right now, there was only her and the machine. She stopped beside the left track, one hand reaching out to touch the sun-hot armor. The metal was familiar under her palm, solid and real in a way few things were anymore. Hey, girl, she whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. It's been a while. The tank, of course, didn't answer. 50 tons of steel and composite armor don't have feelings, don't remember their crews, don't care who touches them, or who commands them, or who bleeds trying to keep them running. But Hannah could absolutely swear, that the metal under her hand felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. She circled slowly, her eyes cataloging details. The specialists watched her like she was performing some kind of mystical ritual. In a way, she was. This was the liturgy of armor, the sacred rite of diagnosis that no computer could replicate. You had to see with your hands, listen with your gut. Trust the machine to tell you the truth, even when it was lying to everyone else. She stopped at the engine bay, ran her fingers along the housing seam, felt the faint vibration of heat radiating from components that had been turned over again and again without ever catching fire. Private, she called to the young PFC. Ma'am. He scrambled to attention so fast he nearly hit his head on the tank's undercarriage. I need a 14mm wrench and a rubber mallet. Nothing else. His eyes went wide. That's it. That's it. He ran toward the tool chest like his boots were on fire. Davis watched him go, then turned to Hannah with an expression of pure bewilderment. You're going to fix a $40 million turbine engine with a wrench and a mallet. Hannah pulled herself up onto the tank's rear deck. Her muscles remembered the movement even after 5 years. She found the handholds without looking settled into position like she'd never left. I'm going to convince her to tell me what's actually wrong. The tools are just for translation. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have to make sense, Chief. It just has to work. The PFC came sprinting back with the tools. Hannah took them, their weight familiar and right in her hands. She leaned into the engine bay, and the smell hit her oil and metal, and that particular sharp scent of sophisticated machinery being pushed to its limits. It was like coming home. Her hands moved without conscious thought, guided by muscle memory and hundreds of hours spent in this exact position. She found the secondary intake housing the panel that the diagnostic system didn't monitor because it was supposed to be simple foolproof. She felt the bolts holding it in place, and they're so subtle she would have missed it if she wasn't specifically looking. She felt the vibration. Wrong. Just slightly wrong. The kind of wrong that whispers rather than screams, that hides in the space between normal and broken. Got you, she whispered. She positioned the wrench and began to loosen the bolts, not removing them, just creating a gap. Just enough space for whatever was choking the airflow to reveal itself. Ma'am, if you break something, Davis started. I won't break anything. But if you do, then you can add it to the list of things I've already broken. Her voice was harder now, carrying the edge of command that 5 years of civilian life hadn't fully erased. Chief, with respect, I need you to stop talking so I can listen. He shut up. Hannah loosened the final bolt. Then she took the rubber mallet and delivered 3 precise measured taps to the housing. Not hard, not violent, just firm enough to dislodge whatever was interfering with the sensor readings. The sound echoed weirdly in the engine bay. Hollow. Wrong. She tightened the bolts back up, wiped her hands on her coveralls, climbed down from the tank with the same easy grace she'd climbed up. When she reached the ground, she found every single person in the motor pool staring at her. Try it now, she said. Davis looked at her, looked at the tank, looked back at her. That's it. That's it. You tapped it with a mallet. I dislodged particulate matter that was interfering with the secondary intake sensor array. The technical term is percussive maintenance. The practical term is I fixed your tank. Reyes made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. Chief, fire her up. Davis moved like a man in a dream. He climbed into the driver's position, his movements mechanical and stunned. Hannah heard him going through the startup sequence, heard the familiar whine of the turbine beginning its spin-up cycle. Please, she thought. Please work. Not for me, not for him. Just work, because that's what you're supposed to do. The turbine wound higher, higher. The whole tank began to vibrate with building energy. And then, with a deep, satisfying roar that Hannah felt in her bones, the AGT 1500 engine caught fire and settled into its characteristic howl. Black smoke belched from the exhaust. The Abrams trembled like a predator waking from sleep. The motor pool erupted. Soldiers cheered. Someone whistled. The PFC actually jumped into the air with both fists raised. Even Reyes allowed himself a small, tight smile. Only Davis remained silent. He climbed out of the driver's position, moving like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. When he reached the ground, he looked at Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shame, gratitude, horror at his own blindness. How? He asked. How did you know? Hannah tucked the challenge coin back into her pocket. Because someone taught me how to listen. The sound of boots on concrete made everyone turn. Colonel Thorne was striding across the motor pool, his phone forgotten, his expression thunderstruck. Behind him came 2 more figures, both wearing stars on their collars. General officers. Hannah's stomach dropped. This was about to get much worse before it got better. Thorne stopped 10 feet away. His eyes went from the idling tank to Hannah to Davis and back to Hannah. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet and very, very controlled. Someone want to tell me what the hell just happened here? Davis snapped to attention so hard, Hannah heard his spine crack. Sir, the tank is operational. We identified and resolved the issue with the secondary intake system. We, Thorne's gaze fixed on him like a laser sight. Chief Davis, I've been watching from the command tent for the last 20 minutes. Your team was standing around looking lost until this woman showed up. So let me ask again what happened. Davis's face was the color of old paper. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Reyes stepped forward. Sir, if I may. The contractor identified the problem and implemented the solution. She has prior experience with the AGT 1500 engine system. Prior experience, Thorne repeated. His eyes moved to Hannah. Really looked at her for the first time, and something in his expression shifted the same recognition that had transformed Reyes's face. Wait, you're... He didn't finish the sentence. He came to attention. His right hand snapped up in a crisp salute directed at Hannah. Every soldier in the motor pool froze. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, mechanically, she returned the salute. Old habits died hard, even when you had no right to them anymore. Thorne dropped his salute, but didn't relax his posture. Captain Hannah Lewis, Crazy Horse Company, 3rd ACR. Just Hannah now, sir. I'm retired. The hell you are. Thorne turned to address the entire assembled group, his voice rising to a command pitch. Soldiers, you are standing in the presence of one of the finest armor officers this army has ever produced. This woman commanded an entire company of M1 tanks for 2 years in sustained combat operations. She never not once had a vehicle deadlined for more than 72 hours. He turned back to Hannah, and his voice dropped but lost none of its intensity. During the Second Battle of Ramadi, her tank took an IED strike that should have knocked it out of the fight. Instead, she improvised a repair under fire and kept her crew in the battle. She saved American lives that day. Multiple American lives. The general officers had caught up now. The younger one, a 1-star with an infantry tab, was staring at Hannah like she'd grown a second head. The older one, wearing 2 stars and the insignia of the armor branch, had gone very still. Captain Lewis, the 2-star said quietly. We've met before. Fort Benning. You gave a presentation on maintenance under combat conditions. Hannah's memory dredged up the event 6 years ago, a dreary conference room speaking to a room of senior officers who'd spent the entire hour checking their phones. Yes, sir. I remember. You told us the Army relied too much on diagnostic computers and not enough on operator intuition. I believe my exact words at the time were... He paused, and something that might have been shame crossed his face. That's an interesting perspective, but we have to trust our systems. Yes, sir. I was wrong. He looked at the idling tank, then at the cluster of embarrassed technicians. I was very wrong. Thorne wasn't done. He turned his attention to Davis, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chief Warrant Officer Davis, you had the most qualified person on this entire post standing right in front of you. She offered you the solution, and you dismissed her. You want to explain that decision to me? Davis looked like he wished the earth would open up and swallow him whole. Sir, I didn't know. She's a contractor. I thought... You didn't think... Thorne cut him off. You looked at a woman in coveralls and decided she couldn't possibly know what she was talking about. You chose the comfortable lie of your diagnostic computer over the uncomfortable truth standing right in front of you. Sir, you're relieved, Chief. Master Sergeant Reyes, you're now in charge of this recovery operation, which apparently is already complete. Thorne took a breath, visibly forcing himself to calm. Chief Davis, report to my office at 1600 hours. We're going to have a very long conversation about judgment, humility, and how pride can compromise a mission. Davis saluted. His hand was shaking. Yes, sir. As he walked away, his shoulders hunched against the weight of his public humiliation, Hannah felt something twist in her chest. She'd seen this happen before, good soldiers destroyed not by incompetence, but by the rigid certainty that they were right, by the inability to imagine that expertise might come in an unexpected package. Colonel, she said quietly. Thorne turned to her. Ma'am, he's a good tech. He knows his systems. He just needs to learn that the systems don't know everything. That's generous of you, Captain. It's Hannah, and it's not generous. It's just true. She glanced at the tank still idling faithfully. Everyone wants to trust the computer because the computer is safe. It gives you clear answers, yes or no, green or red. But machines lie, sir. They lie all the time, and if you can't recognize when they're lying, people die. The two-star general stepped closer. Ms. Lewis, how would you like a job? Hannah blinked. Sir, the Army needs people like you. Officers and NCOs who understand that technology is a tool, not a replacement for experience. Who can teach the next generation that the human element still matters? I'm retired, sir. You're 52 years old and clearly still sharp as a tack. The Army has positions for civilian technical advisors. You could write your own ticket. Something in Hannah's chest pulled tight. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself imagine it. Going back. Teaching. Passing on everything Casey had taught her, everything she'd learned in Blood and Fire. But then she remembered why she'd left. Remembered the board of inquiry, the carefully worded questions, the way senior officers had made it clear that a woman who'd spent 15 years proving herself would never be quite trusted. Would always be an anomaly. An exception. A curiosity. Thank you, sir, she said carefully. But I'm happy where I am. The general looked disappointed but nodded. The offer stands, if you change your mind. Thorne's radio crackled. Colonel, the delegation is arriving at the main gate. ETA to the demonstration area is 30 minutes. Copy that. He turned to the motor pool. All right, people, we have a show to run. Master Sergeant Reyes, get that tank moved to the firing line. Captain, Ms. Lewis. I know I have no authority to ask this of you anymore, but would you stay, at least for the demonstration? Hannah looked at Desert Rose, still humming contentedly. Her hands itched to climb back into that turret, to feel the controls under her fingers again. To remember what it felt like when the world made sense. I'll stay, she said. The next 30 minutes blurred past in organized chaos. The tank was moved. Systems were checked and double-checked. The foreign delegation arrived severe-looking men in crisp uniforms with flags Hannah didn't immediately recognize. They gathered in the observation area while Thorne gave them the prepared speech about American armored superiority. Hannah stood off to the side, trying to be invisible again. But soldiers kept approaching her. A staff sergeant who'd served at Fort Hood when she'd given a training seminar. A lieutenant who'd written a paper on her company's maintenance records at the armor officer course. Young enlisted kids who'd heard the stories and wanted to know if they were true. She answered their questions patiently, feeling like a museum exhibit. The dinosaur. The woman who came before. The exception that proved the rule. Then Reyes appeared at her elbow. Ma'am, Colonel wants to know if you'd be willing to be in the tank for the demonstration. Hannah's heart stopped. What? Just riding in the turret, the crew commander position. The regular TC is fine with it, hell, he'd consider it an honor. Thorne thinks the foreign observers would appreciate seeing the tank operated by someone with actual combat experience. Reyes, I've been out for 5 years. How long have you been breathing? That's different. Is it? His eyes were kind but unyielding. Ma'am, with respect, you put your hands on that tank, and she came alive. Don't tell me that's something you forget. The challenge coin was heavy in her pocket. Hannah thought about Casey, about what he'd say if he were here. Probably something profane and wise at the same time. Something about how you never really stop being what you are, you just pretend for a while. Okay, she heard herself say. Okay, I'll do it. Climbing into Desert Rose's turret felt like stepping through a portal in time. Everything was exactly where it should be. The controls, the displays, the worn patches on the seat where her body had pressed against the fabric for thousands of hours. The crew was young but professional. They introduced themselves with the shy deference people use around legends. Don't treat me like a ghost, Hannah told them. I'm just along for the ride. But when the tank rolled out onto the range, when the engine's roar surrounded her and the familiar vibration shook through her bones, Hannah felt something inside her unlock. A part of herself she'd locked away 5 years ago, convinced it had to stay buried. The demonstration went perfectly. The foreign observers were suitably impressed. Thorne's speech about American military excellence landed with the weight of actual proof rather than empty boasting. And Hannah, for 20 perfect minutes, got to come home. When it was over, when the tank rolled back to the motor pool and shut down, Hannah climbed out slowly. Her legs were shaking. Her eyes were wet, though she'd be damned if she'd let anyone see her cry. Chief Davis was waiting by the tool cage. He looked smaller somehow, younger. He approached cautiously, like a man approaching a dangerous animal. "Ma'am," he started, then stopped, started again. "Captain Lewis, I need to apologize." "You don't need to do anything, Chief." "Yes, I do." His voice was raw. "What I did was inexcusable. I saw a civilian, a woman, someone outside my chain of command, and I decided she didn't matter. I decided my computer knew better than your experience. I was wrong. And I failed my mission because I was wrong." Hannah studied him. Saw genuine remorse there, real understanding. The hardest lessons were the ones that hurt. "Chief," she said quietly, "let me tell you something my platoon sergeant told me when I was a second lieutenant who thought she knew everything. He said, 'Ma'am, the Army doesn't care what you think you know. It cares what you can learn. Stay humble or die stupid.'" Davis managed a weak smile. "Did you listen to him?" "Eventually, after I screwed up enough times." She held out her hand. "You're a good tech, Davis. You know your systems. Just remember that the systems don't know everything, and neither do you. Neither does anyone." He shook her hand, his grip firm despite the tremor. "Thank you, ma'am, for fixing the tank, for not letting me fail completely." "I didn't fix the tank for you, Chief. I fixed her for her." Hannah glanced back at Desert Rose one more time. She deserved to roar. As she walked away from the motor pool, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. Hannah's phone buzzed, probably the simulation center, wondering where she'd been for the last 6 hours. She'd deal with that later. Right now, she just walked. The challenge coin warm in her pocket. The ghost of Turbine Roar still singing in her bones. And for the first time in 5 years, Hannah Lewis felt like maybe, just maybe, she hadn't left everything important behind after all. Some parts of you don't retire. They just wait. Hannah made it halfway across the parking lot before her phone rang. Not the work phone, the other one. The number she'd kept active for 5 years, even though it almost never rang anymore. The number only certain people had. She stopped walking. Her thumb hovered over the screen for 3 rings before she answered. "Lewis." "Hannah." The voice was familiar, rough as gravel, warm as summer asphalt. "It's been a long time." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Colonel Thorne, we just spoke 20 minutes ago." "Not that call. This is different." His tone had shifted from official to something more personal, more careful. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no." Hannah's stomach dropped. Nothing good ever started with those words. "I'm listening." "The demonstration went well. Too well. The foreign delegation wasn't just impressed, they were shocked. Word got back to the Pentagon within an hour. Now I've got a 3-star general asking questions." "Questions about what?" "About you." Thorne paused and Hannah heard him take a breath. "Hannah, they want to know why someone with your expertise is fixing simulators instead of training the next generation of armor officers. They want to know if the Army made a mistake letting you go." The coin was in her hand before she realized she'd pulled it out. Rotation, friction, calm. "The Army didn't let me go, sir. I left." "I know. I read your file. All of it." His voice softened. "I know what happened in Kandahar. I know why you put in your papers." Hannah's vision tunneled. The parking lot disappeared, replaced by a different landscape, mountains sharp as broken glass against a pale sky, the smell of burning fuel and voices screaming through her headset. Commands she'd given, decisions she'd made, her loader's face in the moment before the secondary explosion hit. "Then you know I can't go back," she said quietly. "I know you think you can't. There's a difference." Thorne didn't wait for her to respond. "Listen, I'm not calling to pressure you, but there's something else. The incident today, Davis dismissing you, the maintenance team, ignoring your input, it's not isolated. We're seeing it across the force. Good soldiers, smart soldiers trained to trust their computers more than their instincts, more than experience. That's not my problem to solve anymore. Isn't it?" His voice sharpened. "Hannah, you spent 15 years proving that women could command armor. You set records that still stand. You saved lives. And now the Army is graduating officers who've never seen someone like you, who think expertise looks one way, acts one way, sounds one way. Hannah closed her eyes. What do you want from me? Teach. Not officially. Not full-time. Just come to Fort Moore once a month. Talk to the armor officer basic course students. Tell them what you told me today, that machines lie, that instinct matters, that real expertise doesn't always come in the package you expect. They won't listen to me. I'm a civilian. They'll listen if I make them. And after today, after the story spreads, and it will spread, Hannah, these things always do. They'll want to listen. You're not just another veteran anymore. You're the woman who fixed the tank nobody else could fix. Hannah wanted to say no. Wanted to hang up, get in her car, drive home to her quiet apartment where nobody asked her to be anything other than the person she'd carefully constructed over 5 years of deliberate anonymity. But something in her chest, that thing that had unlocked when she climbed into Desert Rose, wouldn't let her speak. I'll think about it, she finally said. That's all I'm asking. For now. Thorne hesitated. Hannah, one more thing. Chief Davis requested to speak with you, privately. Not an official meeting, he just wants to apologize properly, without an audience. He already apologized. I know, but he's taking this hard, really hard. He's a good kid and he knows he screwed up. If you're willing, it might help him process what happened. Hannah thought about Davis's face when Thorne relieved him, the way his hands had shaken. She'd seen that look before, soldiers confronting the gap between who they thought they were and who they actually were. It was a dangerous moment, the kind that either broke people or rebuilt them stronger. Give him my number, she said. Tell him he can call. No promises beyond that. Thank you. Thorne's relief was audible. And Hannah, what you did today mattered. More than you know. He hung up before she could respond. Hannah stood in the parking lot as the sun dropped lower, painting everything gold and amber. Her phone felt heavy in her hand. The simulation center would be closing soon. She should go back, check and explain her absence with some plausible lie about a family emergency or a doctor's appointment. Instead, she got in her car and drove. She didn't plan the route. Her hands just moved on the wheel, following muscle memory and instinct, until she found herself on a familiar stretch of highway heading east out of the city. The landscape changed gradually. Urban sprawl, giving way to scrubland, then to the kind of empty country that Texas did better than anywhere else. Big sky, bigger silence. 20 minutes later, she pulled off onto a dirt road she'd driven 100 times before, but not once in the last 5 years. The road led to a small cemetery, the kind of place that didn't make it onto maps. Just a scatter of headstones under a few struggling oak trees surrounded by chain-link fence that was more rust than metal. Hannah parked and sat for a long moment, hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing and everything. You're being stupid, she said aloud to the empty car. This doesn't help anything. But she got out anyway. The cemetery gate wasn't locked. It never was. She walked between the headstones, reading names she'd memorized years ago. Local families, veterans from wars that stretched back to World War II. A surprising number of children's graves, their dates clustered in the 1950s, when medicine couldn't save everyone. She found the one she was looking for near the back under the largest oak. The headstone was simple granite, weathered but clean. Someone had been maintaining it, keeping the grass trimmed, leaving fresh flowers that were only a few days old. Staff Sergeant Michael J. Casey, 1968, 2018. U.S. Army, Iraq, Afghanistan. He listened to the machines. Hannah knelt in front of the stone, her knees protesting the movement. She pulled out the challenge coin and set it on top of the headstone where it caught the last rays of sunlight. Hey, Casey, she said quietly. I screwed up today. Or maybe I did something right, I can't tell anymore. The wind rustled through the oak leaves. A crow called from somewhere distant. I fixed a tank. Your tank, actually. Desert Rose. She was choking on bad air intake, just like that time in Ballad. Davis, that's the new generation, the computer kids you always warned me about. He couldn't figure it out. So I showed him. And now everybody knows who I am again. She picked up the coin, held it up to the fading light. I thought I was done with all this. I thought I could just fade away, work my simulator job, pay my bills, stop being Captain Lewis and just be Hannah, regular person Hannah. But then I heard that turbine not catching and it was like you were standing right there telling me to listen. So I did. The coin rotated between her fingers. Once, twice, 3 times. Thorne wants me to teach, to go back to Moore and talk to the new officers. Tell them war stories. Explain that their fancy computers don't know shit. She laughed, but it came out hollow. I can't do that, Casey. I can't stand in front of a classroom and pretend that everything I taught my soldiers was right. Not after Kandahar. Not after I got Danny killed. Her voice cracked on the name. She hadn't said it aloud in 3 years. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and dried grass. Hannah closed her eyes and let herself remember. Really remember, not the sanitized version she'd filed away in the dark corners of her mind. Danny Ortega, 23 years old. Her loader. Kid from El Paso with a smile that could light up a combat outpost and hands that could load a 120mm round faster than anyone she'd ever seen. He'd wanted to be a teacher when he got out. History teacher. He'd talked about it constantly, planning his lessons, practicing his explanations on the rest of the crew. The mission had been routine. Escort a convoy through Kandahar province, link up with Afghan forces, return to base. Simple, clean, the kind of operation they'd done 50 times without incident. But Hannah's instinct had been screaming. Something about the route felt wrong. The way the local population had disappeared from the roads, the odd silence on the radio chatter, the way the dust hung in the air like it was waiting for something. She'd voiced her concerns to the mission commander, a captain younger than her, less experienced but male, and therefore somehow more trustworthy in the eyes of the colonel running the operation. He'd dismissed her, told her she was being paranoid, said the route was cleared, the intelligence was solid, the mission was green-lit from higher up. She could have refused, could have pulled her tank off the convoy, could have made a scene. But she'd been tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being the woman who always questioned orders, who always saw problems nobody else saw, who always had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. So she'd followed orders. The IED had been sophisticated, a shaped charge designed specifically to defeat tank armor, triggered remotely by someone who knew exactly where to aim. It had punched through Desert Rose's side armor like it was paper, and the secondary explosion had turned the interior into an incinerator. Hannah had been in the commander's position, partially protected by the turret structure. Her gunner and driver had been shielded enough to survive with injuries. But Danny, standing in the loader's position, had taken the full force of the blast. He'd lived for 47 seconds. Long enough to look at Hannah with confused, dying eyes and ask, "Did I load it right, ma'am? Did I do it right?" She'd held his hand while he died, trapped in the burning tank, waiting for the fire suppression system to kick in, unable to move him, unable to save him. The investigation had cleared her of wrongdoing. The after-action report had noted her concerns about the route, but concluded that she'd followed proper chain of command in voicing them. The captain who'd dismissed her warnings received a letter of reprimand, but kept his command. Danny got a Bronze Star and a flag-draped coffin. Hannah got survivor's guilt and the absolute certainty that if she'd trusted her instinct, if she'd been stronger, louder, more willing to make enemies, Danny would still be alive. She'd put in her retirement papers 2 weeks later. Now kneeling in front of Casey's grave with the challenge coin warm in her hand, Hannah felt the weight of the day crash down on her. She'd fixed the tank. She'd proven her expertise. She'd been vindicated in front of everyone who'd dismissed her, and it didn't change anything. Danny was still dead. The army still had officers like that captain making decisions based on pride instead of wisdom. And she was still the woman who'd chosen obedience over instinct at the exact wrong moment. "I can't teach Casey," she whispered. "I can't tell those kids to trust themselves when I didn't trust myself when it mattered most." Her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but the screen showed an unknown number with a local area code. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. "Lewis." "Ma'am, this is Chief Warrant Officer Davis." His voice was tentative, almost fragile. Colonel Thorne said you'd agreed to let me call. If this is a bad time, it's fine. Hannah wiped her eyes with her free hand. What do you need, Chief? I need to apologize. Properly. Not the half-assed thing I said at the motor pool with everyone watching. He took a shaky breath. Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 12 years. I've been working on armor systems for 8. I'm certified on every diagnostic platform the Army uses. And today I stood in front of a dead tank for 6 hours, accomplishing nothing, while the person who actually knew how to fix it stood right there watching me fail. Hannah didn't respond. She just listened. I keep thinking about what you said, about machines lying, about trusting instinct over computers. His voice got quieter. Ma'am, I don't know how to do that. The Army trained me to follow procedures, to trust the data, to believe that if I follow the checklist correctly, I'll find the answer. And today the checklist failed and I had nothing else. What do you want from me, Chief? I want to know how you do it, how you knew, how you can look at a tank that's lying to every sensor it has and still figure out what's wrong. He paused. And I want to know how I can learn to do that before I fail another mission. Hannah looked at Casey's headstone. The flowers someone had left were wilting in the heat, their edges brown and curled. She wondered who still visited after 6 years. Family, probably. Or maybe another old soldier who remembered. You can't learn it from me, she said finally. Ma'am, you can't learn it from anyone, Chief. You learn it from the machines themselves. You put your hands on them. You listen to them. You make mistakes and fix them, and make different mistakes and fix those too. You spend 10,000 hours failing until failure teaches you what success looks like. She stood up, brushing dust from her knees. The checklist is a starting point, not an ending point. It tells you what to look for, but it can't tell you what to hear. But you heard it. Today, you knew exactly what was wrong. I knew because I'd seen that exact failure 7 times before, because I'd spent 2 years listening to that specific engine every single day, because I'd made that same diagnostic mistake when I was younger and stupider and it nearly got my crew killed. Her voice hardened. You want to know the truth, Chief? The real truth, I knew what was wrong because I'd already failed that test, multiple times, in places where failure meant death. Davis was quiet for a long moment. I don't want to fail like that. Then stop trusting the computer to save you. Stop believing that procedure will solve every problem. And for God's sake, stop dismissing people who might know more than you just because they don't look like they should. Yes, ma'am. And Chief, what happened today wasn't your fault. Not really. The Army trained you to think like you think, to trust what you trust. That's a systemic issue, not a personal failing. But now you know better. So the question is what you do with that knowledge. She heard him take a breath. Ma'am, if you ever decide to teach, I mean really teach, not just give speeches, I'd be honored to be your first student. Hannah's throat tightened. I'm not teaching anyone anything, Chief. Then maybe you could just tell me stories sometime, about how you fix things in Iraq, about how you learned to listen, about... He stopped himself. I'm sorry, I'm asking too much. You don't owe me anything. No, I don't. Hannah looked at the setting sun, the sky bleeding red and purple. But if you want to buy me coffee sometime and listen to an old soldier ramble, I won't say no. The relief in his voice was palpable. Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. After he hung up, Hannah stood in the cemetery for another 10 minutes just breathing. The day had been too long, too intense, too full of ghosts she'd spent 5 years trying to bury. But something had shifted. Some weight she'd been carrying had redistributed itself, settling into a place that didn't hurt quite as much. She picked up the challenge coin from Casey's headstone. I still think you're wrong about all this, she told the grave. I still think I should stay retired, but I'll think about it. That's all I'm promising. The drive back to her apartment took 40 minutes. She lived in a small complex on the north side of town. Nothing fancy, just a 1-bedroom with enough space for her books and her silence. She parked, climbed the stairs, unlocked her door, and stopped dead. There was an envelope on her floor. Someone had slipped it under the door. Hannah picked it up carefully. No return address, no postmark, just her name written in neat, precise handwriting on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph showed a group of soldiers standing in front of desert rows. Young faces, clean uniforms, the kind of formal unit photo that every company took before deployment. Hannah recognized it immediately. Crazy Horse Company 2011, right before they shipped to Iraq. She found herself in the back row, the only woman in the picture, her face younger and harder, and somehow more certain than it had any right to be. Casey stood next to her, his hand raised in a casual salute, grinning like he owned the world. Danny was in the front row, kneeling with the other junior enlisted. His smile was huge. He looked like a kid playing soldier, not a soldier playing at life. The letter was short. Captain Lewis, where was Specialist Rodriguez. You probably don't remember me. I was in 3rd Platoon, one of your mechanics. I got out 4 years ago, and I'm teaching auto shop at a high school in Austin now. I heard what happened today at Fort Hood. The guys still talk to each other, you know. Word travels. I wanted you to know that what you taught us still matters. I teach my students the same things you taught us. Listen to the machine. Trust your instincts. Don't let anyone tell you you're wrong just because you're different. You saved my life once. Ramadi 2012. My track threw a link in the middle of a firefight, and you drove your tank between me and the enemy while I fixed it. I never got to thank you properly for that. So thank you. For everything you taught us, for everything you gave us, for being the kind of officer who made us believe we could be better than we were. Your soldiers didn't forget you, ma'am. We never will. Marco Rodriguez. Hannah read the letter 3 times. Then she set it carefully on her kitchen counter, made herself a cup of coffee she didn't want, and sat in the dark living room staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Captain Lewis, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen. I'm at Fort Moore going through AOBC right now. My instructor told us what happened today. He said you're the reason he still has a career. I just wanted to say thank you for showing us that armor officers can look different than we're taught to expect. Some of us need to see that. Hannah stared at the message for a long time. Then another one came through. Ma'am, this is former Sergeant Williams' Crazy Horse Company. Heard you're back around tanks. Made my whole damn week. Stay strong. Then another Captain Lewis, you don't know me, but my father served under you in Iraq. He died 2 years ago, but he always said you were the finest officer he ever knew. Thank you for being an example. The messages kept coming. Former soldiers, current soldiers, family members of people she'd served with. Every single one of them saying the same thing in different words. You mattered. You still matter. We remember. By the time the sun fully set, Hannah had received 17 messages. 17 reminders that the person she'd tried to bury wasn't quite as dead as she'd hoped. She sat in the dark, holding the challenge coin, reading the messages over and over until the words blurred together. And somewhere in that darkness, in that silence, a decision began to form. Not a clear one, not an easy one. Just a small, stubborn conviction that maybe, just maybe, Casey and Thorne and all these voices from her past were trying to tell her something she needed to hear. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Colonel Thorne. I'll teach your class. Once. One time only. If they're awful, I'm out. His response came back in seconds. That's all I'm asking. Thank you, Hannah. First class is in 2 weeks. I'll send details. Hannah set the phone down and looked at the photograph again. At Casey's grin, at Danny's smile, at her own younger face, so sure of itself, so convinced that being right was the same as being strong. I still don't know if this is a good idea, she said to the empty room. But for the first time in 5 years, she felt like maybe she was willing to find out. The next morning came too early and too bright. Hannah woke up at 0500 out of habit, even though she had nowhere to be. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind already racing through everything that had happened yesterday, everything that was going to happen in 2 weeks, everything that could go wrong. She made coffee, checked her email, found 47 messages waiting, including 3 from reporters who'd somehow gotten her contact information and wanted to tell her story. She deleted those without reading past the subject lines. There was also an email from the simulation center supervisor asking where she'd been yesterday. She wrote back with a vague explanation about a family emergency, and a promise to make up the hours. Then, because she apparently couldn't help herself, she opened a new search window and typed Fort Moore Armor Officer Basic Course Curriculum. The course outline came up immediately. 22 weeks of training covering everything from basic gunnery to maintenance procedures to tactical doctrine. She scanned through the syllabus, noting the sections on leadership ethics, combat operations. What she didn't see anywhere was a class on trusting yourself when the computer says you're wrong. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up anyway. Lewis. Captain Lewis. The voice was young, female, uncertain. My name is Second Lieutenant Jessica Hawkins. I'm currently at Fort Moore in the Armor Basic course. Colonel Thorne told our class yesterday that you'd be coming to speak to us. Hannah's stomach dropped. Word travels fast. Ma'am, I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to call before you came to ask. The lieutenant stopped collecting her thoughts. Ma'am, I'm one of 3 women in a class of 47 officers, and every single day someone finds a way to remind me that I don't belong, that women can't handle armor, that I'm here because of quotas, not qualifications. Lieutenant, please ma'am, let me finish. Yesterday, my instructor told us about what you did, how you fixed a tank that nobody else could fix, how you commanded a company with a perfect maintenance record, how you saved your crew under fire. Her voice got stronger, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, some of you in this room have been treating Lieutenant Hawkins like she's less capable because she's a woman. I want you to understand that Captain Lewis would run circles around every single one of you, and she'd do it in her sleep. Hannah's eyes stung. She couldn't speak. Ma'am, I just wanted you to know that you teaching our class isn't just some interesting guest lecture for most of us. For people like me, it's proof that we're not crazy, that we can do this, that someone like us already did. The lieutenant took a breath. So thank you for whatever you're going to tell us. We need to hear it. Hannah found her voice. Lieutenant, I'm not a hero. You're just a person who did an impossible job perfectly and made it look easy. That's exactly what we need to see. A pause. I'll let you go, ma'am. I just wanted you to know that this matters. To some of us, it matters more than you can imagine. She hung up before Hannah could respond. Hannah sat there holding the phone, staring at Casey's photograph still sitting on her counter, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, opening. Like a door she'd welded shut was finally reluctantly swinging free. Damn it, Casey, she whispered. You always did know how to back me into a corner. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to figure out what she was going to say to a room full of young officers who thought they knew everything and knew nothing at all. 2 weeks to decide if she was brave enough to stand in front of them and admit that being right wasn't always enough. That sometimes you failed anyway. That expertise and experience and instinct could all be perfect, and you could still lose someone you promised to bring home. 2 weeks to figure out if Hannah Lewis, not Captain Lewis, not the legend, not the woman in the stories, had anything worth teaching. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from Master Sergeant Reyes. Ma'am, heard you're teaching at Moore. Make sure you tell them about the time you hotwired a radio using nothing but gum wrapper and pure spite. These kids need to know that being an officer is 10% knowledge and 90% refusing to accept that anything is impossible. Despite everything, Hannah smiled. Maybe she did have something to teach after all. The 2 weeks passed like water through a sieve too fast, and yet each day stretched endlessly. Hannah spent her evenings preparing notes she knew she'd never use, writing speeches she'd never deliver, trying to organize 15 years of experience into something coherent enough to teach. Everything she wrote sounded like a lie. On the morning she was supposed to drive to Fort Moore, she sat in her car for 20 minutes, keys in the ignition, unable to turn it on. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Colonel Thorne. She'd promised him she'd be there by 0900. It was already 0730, and the drive was 2 hours. She was going to be late, or she wasn't going to show up at all. Her hands were shaking. The challenge coin sat on the passenger seat where she'd placed it the night before, a talisman, a reminder, an accusation. Casey's voice echoed in her memory. You can't help people if you're not willing to show them your scars, ma'am. Perfect officers don't teach anyone anything except how to lie better. Hannah picked up the coin, started the car, drove. She made it to Fort Moore with 10 minutes to spare, her heart hammering the entire way. The main gate guard checked her ID 3 times, confused by her contractor credentials, but the appointment notation in his system that said guest instructor, armor school. Finally, he waved her through with directions to building 45-5D. The classroom was exactly what she expected. Institutional beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps, rows of chairs filled with young officers in ACU uniforms trying to look more confident than they felt. Hannah counted 46 of them. 43 men, 3 women. The women sat separately, scattered through the room like they'd learned not to cluster together and draw attention. Colonel Thorne stood at the front mid-sentence in what sounded like an introduction. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. And here she is now. Officers, stand up. The room erupted into motion. 46 chairs scraped against linoleum. 46 officers came to attention with varying degrees of precision. Hannah froze. Colonel, that's not necessary. Captain Lewis served 15 years in armor. She commanded Crazy Horse Company through some of the heaviest fighting in Iraq. She holds records that none of you will ever break. Thorne's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. When she speaks, you listen. When she tells you you're wrong. Clear? Yes, sir. The response was thunderous, automatic. Seats. They sat. Every eye in the room fixed on Hannah, with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism to something that looked like desperate hope on the faces of the 3 women. Hannah walked to the front of the room. Her legs felt disconnected from her body. The challenge coin was a lead weight in her pocket. Colonel Thorne is generous with his introduction. She started, her voice steadier than she felt. The truth is simpler. I fixed tanks. I commanded soldiers. I made a lot of mistakes and learned from most of them. A hand shot up in the 3rd row. A second lieutenant with a ranger tab and the kind of squared-away appearance that screamed West Point. Yes, Lieutenant. Ma'am, Colonel Thorne said you fixed the SEPV-3 at Fort Hood last week. That 6 trained technicians couldn't solve it, but you did it in 90 seconds with a wrench and a mallet. Is that true? Hannah felt 46 pairs of eyes boring into her. The time frame is exaggerated, but yes, I identified and resolved a maintenance issue. How? The question came from a different lieutenant, this one with an infantry tab and the lean, hungry look of someone who'd enlisted first and commissioned later. The report said the diagnostic systems showed green across the board. The diagnostic systems were reading phantom data from compromised sensors. But how did you know that? A third voice. A woman this time. Second Lieutenant Hawkins Hannah realized, recognizing the voice from the phone call. How did you know the sensors were lying? Hannah pulled out the challenge coin, held it up so they could all see it. Because a very smart NCO taught me that machines lie. Constantly. Professionally. They lie because they can't help it. They report what they're designed to report, not what's actually happening. That doesn't make sense, ma'am. The West Point lieutenant, again, his tone respectful but challenging. The Army spends billions on diagnostic systems specifically so we don't have to guess. I'm not telling you to guess, Lieutenant. I'm telling you to verify, to trust, but confirm. To remember that every sensor has limitations, and every computer has blind spots. She started pacing the coin, rotating between her fingers. Let me ask you something. How many of you have been through a motor pool maintenance bay in the last month? About 30 hands went up. And how many of you have personally put your hands on an engine not observed, not supervised, actually touched the machinery you're supposedly experts in operating? The hands dropped, one by one, until only 5 remained up. That's the problem, Hannah said quietly. You're being trained to manage systems, not understand machines. You're taught to read diagnostic outputs instead of listening to what the tank is actually telling you. The infantry-tabbed lieutenant leaned forward. Ma'am, with respect, we don't have time in the training pipeline to become master mechanics. That's why we have maintenance teams. You're right. You don't have time to become mechanics, but you have time to become commanders who know enough to question the mechanics when they're wrong. who can recognize when the checklist has failed, and instinct needs to take over. She stopped pacing. The AGT 1500 turbine engine has 17,000 moving parts. The diagnostic system monitors maybe 3,000 of them. What happens to the other 14,000 when something goes wrong? Silence. They fail in the blind spots, Hannah continued. In the places the computer isn't looking. And if you're the kind of officer who trusts the green lights on a screen more than the sound of a choking engine, your tank dies. And maybe your crew with it. A hand went up in the back. A female lieutenant with the cautious expression of someone who'd learned to make herself small. Ma'am, when you were at Fort Hood, the maintenance team told you to leave. They said you didn't have authorization. Why didn't you just go? The room went very quiet. This was the question they all wanted answered, but hadn't dared to ask. Hannah met the lieutenant's eyes. Because I knew I was right. But they had authority. They had rank. They had the official diagnostic equipment. The lieutenant's voice was soft but insistent. How do you know when to push back and when to accept that maybe you're wrong? You don't. Hannah's voice cut through the room like a blade. You never know for certain. That's what makes it hard. That's what costs you sleep. You have to make a judgment call with incomplete information and live with the consequences. The West Point lieutenant raised his hand again. Ma'am, that sounds like a recipe for chaos. For every officer doing whatever they think is right, regardless of orders or procedure. It is. If the officers are bad. Hannah looked at him directly. But if they're good, if they're trained to think critically, to question appropriately, to trust their expertise while remaining humble enough to learn, then it's how you win wars. Because the enemy doesn't follow your procedures. Combat doesn't care about your checklist. But you can't just teach instinct, another voice called out. Either you have it or you don't. That's bullshit. The profanity hung in the air. Hannah didn't apologize for it. Instinct is pattern recognition built from experience. You develop it by failing, by fixing your failures, by paying attention to what went wrong and why. Every single person in this room can develop combat instinct, but only if you're willing to be wrong first. The infantry tabbed lieutenant stood up. Ma'am, you keep talking about being wrong, about making mistakes, but your record is perfect. 540 days without a deadlined vehicle. That's not making mistakes, that's being better than everyone else. Hannah's chest tightened. The coin was slick with sweat in her palm. This was the moment, the choice. She could maintain the legend, keep the armor intact, let them believe that expertise was the same as infallibility, or she could tell them the truth. My record isn't perfect, Lieutenant. Sit down. He sat. Hannah turned to Colonel Thorne. Sir, permission to speak freely about classified operations. Thorne's expression was unreadable. Granted. This room is secure. Hannah turned back to the class. 46 faces. 46 officers who thought they were here to learn how to be legendary. She was about to teach them something else entirely. In 2018, I was commanding Crazy Horse Company in Kandahar province. We got orders for a convoy escort mission. Simple job. Routine. I'd done it 50 times. Her voice was steady, clinical. But something felt wrong. The route was too quiet. The local population had evacuated. The radio chatter was off. I told the mission commander a captain outranked me in the operation, even though I had more combat experience, that I thought we were walking into an ambush. The room was absolutely silent. He dismissed my concerns, told me I was being paranoid, said the intelligence was solid and the route was cleared, and Her voice caught. She forced it steady again. I followed his orders, because I was tired of fighting, tired of being the woman who always questioned everything, tired of being difficult. She pulled the challenge coin out of her pocket, held it up so they could all see it shaking in her hand. We rolled out. The IED hit my tank exactly where I knew it would. A shaped charge designed to penetrate side armor. It punched through like paper. Her voice was flat, now empty of emotion. My driver and gunner survived. I survived. My loader staff sergeant, Danny Ortega, 23 years old, died 47 seconds after the blast while I held his hand and couldn't do a damn thing to save him. Someone in the back row made a small sound, almost a gasp. The investigation cleared me, said I'd followed proper procedure. The captain got a letter of reprimand. Danny got a Bronze Star and a funeral. Hannah's hands were shaking so badly the coin almost fell. And I learned that being right doesn't mean shit if you're not brave enough to act on it. The silence was crushing. So when you ask me how I knew to push back at Fort Hood, how I knew to ignore the warrant officer telling me to leave, how I knew to trust my instinct over their computers, that's how. Because I already paid the price for not trusting myself. I already buried a soldier who died because I chose obedience over expertise. She looked at each of them in turn. And I will be damned if I let any of you make the same mistake. Lieutenant Hawkins stood up slowly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ma'am, how do you live with that? Hannah met her eyes. Some days, I don't, Lieutenant. Some days I wake up and I can't breathe because Danny's face is the first thing I see. Some days I sit in my car for 20 minutes trying to convince myself to go to work. Some days I think about driving off a bridge instead. The room had gone from silent to suffocating. But most days, Hannah continued, her voice strengthening. I remember that Danny wanted to be a teacher. He spent 2 years in that tank telling me about the history lessons he was going to give when he got home, about how he wanted to teach kids that the past mattered, that their choices had consequences. She tucked the coin back in her pocket. So I live with it by trying to teach what he couldn't, by making sure his death meant something. By standing in rooms like this and telling officers who think they know everything that they don't know shit. The West Point lieutenant's hand went up. His face had gone pale. Ma'am, if you had refused the mission, if you'd pulled your tank out of the convoy, you would have been court-martialed. Probably. You would have lost your command. Definitely. Your career would have been over. Yes, Hannah's voice was hard as steel. But Danny would still be alive. So you tell me, Lieutenant, what's worth more? Your career or your soldier's life? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The infantry-tabbed lieutenant stood up again. Ma'am, you're asking us to risk everything, to trust ourselves over our superiors, to question orders, to potentially destroy our careers on instinct. No. Hannah's voice cut through his words. I'm asking you to be officers, real officers, the kind who take responsibility for their decisions and their consequences. The kind who understand that following orders isn't the same as doing right. She paused. And yes, sometimes that means risking your career. Because if you're not willing to risk your career to save your soldiers, you have no business commanding them. A different voice called out from the middle of the room. Ma'am, the Army can't function if every officer is second-guessing orders. The Army can't function if officers stop thinking critically. There's a difference between second-guessing and critical evaluation. Hannah started pacing again. I'm not telling you to disobey every order you disagree with. I'm telling you to develop the judgment to know when disagreement matters, when the cost of obedience is higher than the cost of defiance. But how? The question came from multiple voices simultaneously. By learning, by failing, by paying attention to the soldiers who know more than you do, the NCOs, the specialists, the private first class who's been turning wrenches since before you were commissioned. Hannah stopped pacing. And by remembering that expertise doesn't look one way, doesn't sound one way, doesn't wear the uniform you expect. Lieutenant Hawkins raised her hand. Ma'am, are you talking about gender? I'm talking about assumptions. Hannah looked at her directly. When Chief Davis saw me at Fort Hood, he saw a woman in contractor coveralls. He assumed I didn't know anything worth hearing. His assumptions almost cost him his career and definitely cost the Army an operational tank at a critical moment. What assumptions are you carrying around, Lieutenant? Hawkins' face flushed. Ma'am, It's not a criticism, it's a question. What assumptions do you make about who has valuable expertise? About who deserves to be listened to? About who can command armor? Hannah turned to address the whole room. Every single one of you has assumptions. Most of them are invisible to you. They're the water you swim in, so constant you don't notice them. But those assumptions will kill your soldiers if you don't learn to see them. The West Point lieutenant's hand went up again. Ma'am, with respect, the Army is trying to address these issues. We have diversity training. We have inclusion programs. We're getting better. Are you? Hannah's voice was sharp. Because last week, a certified maintenance team spent 6 hours failing to solve a problem, while the person with the solution stood right there being ignored. That's not a training issue, Lieutenant. That's a culture issue, and culture doesn't change because of a PowerPoint presentation. A male voice from the back, angry now. So what are we supposed to do? Assume every woman, every minority, every contractor knows more than trained personnel. No. Hannah's response was immediate. You're supposed to assess expertise based on demonstrated knowledge, not appearance. You're supposed to listen to what people say before you decide whether they're worth hearing. You're supposed to remember that the Army's strength isn't in everyone looking the same, it's in using every available resource regardless of where it comes from. The angry lieutenant stood up. Ma'am, that sounds great in theory, but in combat you need to make snap judgments. You need to trust your chain of command. You need to follow orders without hesitation. You need to follow lawful orders without hesitation, Hannah corrected. There's a difference. And if you can't see that difference, you're going to get people killed. She paused. Like I did. The room went silent again. Hannah took a breath. I didn't come here to inspire you. I didn't come here to tell you war stories that make you feel good about your career choice. I came here because Colonel Thorne asked me to, and because I owe it to Danny Ortega to make sure his death teaches something. She looked at each of them. You're all about to commission, about to lead soldiers, about to make decisions that have life and death consequences, and the Army will give you every tool except the most important one, the judgment to know when the tools are wrong. Lieutenant Hawkins stood up again. Ma'am, how do we develop that judgment? By being honest about your failures. By learning from people who know more than you. By staying humble enough to admit when you're wrong. Hannah pulled out the challenge coin one more time. This belonged to my platoon sergeant. He gave it to me the day I took command. He told me, ma'am, the coin is a reminder. Every time you touch it, ask yourself, am I being the officer my soldiers need, or the officer I want to be? She held it up so they could all see. Those aren't always the same thing. The officer you want to be follows procedure, looks good in front of superiors, never makes waves. The officer your soldiers need questions, bad orders, trusts their expertise over politics, and accepts that sometimes doing right means destroying your career. The infantry tab lieutenant spoke quietly. You chose your career over your soldiers once, ma'am. When you followed that convoy order, you admitted that. Yes. And it's haunted you ever since. Every single day. So what would you do differently if you could go back? Hannah didn't hesitate. I'd refuse the order. I'd pull my tank out of the convoy. I'd accept the court-martial. I'd lose my command, my career, everything, and Danny would still be alive. That's the trade I'd make. Every time. Another long silence. The West Point lieutenant stood up slowly. Ma'am, if we're being honest, and you've asked us to be honest, most of us aren't brave enough to do that, to sacrifice our careers on instinct, to trust ourselves that much. I know. Hannah's voice was soft now. I wasn't brave enough either, not when it mattered. That's why I'm standing here telling you this story. So maybe one of you will be braver than I was. So maybe one of you will save your soldier when I couldn't save mine. Lieutenant Hawkins wiped her eyes. Ma'am, why did you retire? After everything you'd accomplished, after all the soldiers you'd saved, why walk away? Because I stopped trusting myself. Because every time I looked at a tank, I saw Danny's face. Because I couldn't stand the thought of commanding soldiers I might fail again. Hannah's voice cracked. I've been hiding for 5 years, Lieutenant. Working a quiet job. Staying invisible. Trying to pretend I'm not Captain Lewis anymore. Just Hannah. Regular civilian Hannah who doesn't have to make life and death decisions. But you came back, a male voice said from the side. Last week. You could have stayed behind the safety line. Could have let them fail. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Hannah looked at the coin in her hand. Because Casey, my platoon sergeant, would have kicked my ass if I'd let a perfectly good tank sit broken when I knew how to fix it. Because sometimes you don't get to choose when to be who you are. Sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you're needed, and you either step up or live with another failure. Colonel Thorne, who'd been silent this entire time, finally spoke. "Captain Lewis, may I ask you a question?" "Yes, sir." "Knowing what you know now, knowing the price you've paid, would you still choose armor? Would you still become an officer, or would you tell your younger self to pick a different path?" Hannah thought about that for a long moment. About Casey. About Danny. About Desert Rose and all the other tanks she'd commanded, fixed, loved. About the soldiers she'd saved and the ones she couldn't. About 15 years of choosing every day to be someone the world didn't quite believe could exist. I'd tell my younger self it's going to be harder than she imagines, that she'll have to be twice as good to be considered half as competent, that she'll lose soldiers and it will destroy her, that she'll spend 5 years hiding from who she is because the pain of being seen is too much. She looked at the 3 female lieutenants in the room. But I'd also tell her that it matters, that every time she proves a woman can command armor, she makes it easier for the next one, that her existence is resistance, that simply being excellent is a revolutionary act. She looked back at Thorne. "So yes, sir, I'd choose it again, even knowing the cost." The room erupted. Not with sound, the officers were too disciplined for that, but with movement, hands raised, bodies leaning forward. The energy had shifted from skeptical listening to engaged hunger. "Ma'am, what do we do when our superiors are wrong?" "You present evidence, you make your case, you document everything, and if they still won't listen, you make the hardest choice of your career." "Ma'am, how do we know when we're being rightfully confident versus dangerously arrogant?" Confidence invites questions. Arrogance dismisses them. If you can't explain why you're right to someone who disagrees, you're probably being arrogant. "Ma'am, what if we're the only ones who see the problem? What if everyone else thinks we're wrong?" "Then you'd better be absolutely certain you're right, because standing alone is expensive. But sometimes it's necessary." The questions kept coming. Hannah answered them all, her voice growing stronger as she realized what was happening. These officers weren't looking for a hero. They were looking for permission to be human, permission to doubt, permission to question, permission to be the kind of leaders the Army needed instead of the kind the Army expected. Finally, after 90 minutes that felt like 90 seconds, Colonel Thorne stood up. "Officers, Captain Lewis has given you more valuable instruction in the last hour and a half than most of you will receive in your entire careers. I expect you to treat her words with the gravity they deserve." He turned to Hannah. "Ma'am, I can't thank you enough. This is exactly what these officers needed to hear." Hannah tucked the challenge coin back in her pocket. "Sir, I'm not sure I gave them what they needed. I think I just traumatized them with honesty." "That's the same thing, Captain." He smiled slightly. "The truth is traumatic, especially when you're young and certain and the Army has told you everything is black and white. You just showed them the gray. They'll spend the rest of their careers trying to navigate it." The officers were standing now, gathering their things, but several were approaching the front of the room. Lieutenant Hawkins reached Hannah first. "Ma'am, thank you for being honest about your failure, for showing us that perfect officers don't exist." Her voice dropped. "And for showing us that women can command armor even when it costs everything." "Lieutenant, you can command armor. The question is whether you'll let anyone convince you otherwise." After today, Hawkins shook her head. "No, ma'am. Never again." The West Point lieutenant was next. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I came in here thinking this would be a feel-good session about how great the Army is. You gave us something much harder and much more valuable." "Don't apologize, Lieutenant. Just remember this conversation the first time you're tempted to dismiss someone because they don't fit your expectations." The infantry tab lieutenant approached last. "Ma'am, what you said about sacrificing your career for your soldiers. I'm not sure I'm that brave, but I'm going to try to be." "That's all anyone can do, Lieutenant. Try. And when you fail, because you will fail, learn from it. Don't hide from it like I did." As the room emptied, Hannah found herself alone with Colonel Thorne. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know they're going to talk about this for years," he said quietly. "The day Captain Lewis came to Fort Moore and told them being a perfect officer is impossible. I didn't say it's impossible. I said it's not worth pursuing. There's a difference. Is there? He smiled. Hannah, what you did today, that's teaching. Real teaching. Not PowerPoint slides and doctrine. You showed them your scars and let them learn from your pain. That's the kind of instruction that changes careers. Hannah's hands were still shaking. I'm not sure I can do that again, sir. I'm not asking you to. Not regularly. He paused. But there are other units, other commands, other places where officers need to hear what you just told this room, and there are senior leaders who need to hear it even more. Sir, I'm not pressuring you. I'm just saying the offer stands, whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready. He picked up his briefcase. You're one of the finest officers I've never had the privilege to command, Captain. Don't let fear keep you from doing what you're clearly meant to do. He left her standing in the empty classroom alone with fluorescent lights and the ghosts of 46 young officers who'd just learned that expertise and trauma were often the same thing. Hannah pulled out her phone. 7 missed calls. 12 text messages. She scrolled through them quickly. 3 from former soldiers thanking her. 2 from reporters she'd never speak to. 1 from Chief Davis asking if they could reschedule their coffee meeting. And 1 from a number she didn't recognize, Captain Lewis. This is Colonel Sarah Martinez, Brigade Commander at Fort Carson. I heard what you did today. We need to talk. Hannah stared at the message for a long time. The classroom was very quiet. The kind of quiet that made you hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, your own fear. She thought about Danny, about Casey, about Desert Rose, about all the soldiers she'd commanded, and all the lessons she'd learned, and all the failures she'd survived. Then she typed a response. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever conversation you want to have. The response came back immediately. I'm not asking if you're ready. I'm asking if you're willing. Hannah looked at the challenge coin in her hand, rotated it once, twice, 3 times. Then she typed, send me the details. The details came through 3 hours later while Hannah was still driving home. Her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her mind replaying every word she'd said in that classroom. The phone buzzed, and she pulled over at a rest stop to read Colonel Martinez's message. Fort Carson, 3 days from now. We're implementing new maintenance protocols across the brigade, and my senior NCOs are resisting. They think computers are replacing their expertise. They're not entirely wrong. I need someone who can bridge that gap, someone who can speak both languages. One day. That's all I'm asking. Hannah typed back without thinking. What makes you think I can do that? The response was immediate, because you already did it at Fort Hood, because you speak mechanic and you speak officer and you speak computer, because my soldiers need to hear from someone who's been where they are. Hannah stared at the phone. 3 days. Fort Carson was in Colorado, a 5-hour flight, a world away from the quiet anonymity she'd built. She could say no, should say no. Every instinct told her to protect herself, to stop, before this momentum carried her somewhere she couldn't come back from. But Lieutenant Hawkins' voice echoed in her memory. For people like me, it's proof that we're not crazy. She typed, one day. I'm not making any promises beyond that. That's all I need. I'll send travel arrangements. Hannah sat in her car at the rest stop for another 20 minutes, watching trucks rumble past on the interstate, feeling like she was standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying. The challenge coin was warm in her pocket. She pulled it out, studied Casey's face in her memory, the way he'd grinned when she'd done something particularly stupid and survived it, the way he'd shaken his head when she'd tried to follow regulations that made no sense. You'd tell me I'm being an idiot, she said to the coin. You'd tell me to stop overthinking and just do the job. The coin didn't answer. It never did. But somehow its weight felt like permission. She drove home, slept badly, spent the next 2 days trying to focus on her simulation center work while her mind kept wandering to Colorado, to soldiers she'd never met, to problems she didn't fully understand. Chief Davis called, and they met for coffee at a place near the base. He looked better than he had at the motor pool, less shattered, more thoughtful. Ma'am, I wanted to update you, he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. I wasn't court-martialed. Colonel Thorne put me on a remedial training program instead. I'm spending 6 weeks with the senior mechanics learning what the computers don't tell us. How's that going? It's humbling. He finally looked up at her. I had a master sergeant show me yesterday how to diagnose a fuel injection problem by listening to the engine idle. Just listening, no diagnostic equipment, a stick. No sensors, just his ear and 40 years of experience. He paused. I would have dismissed him a month ago, would have told him we had better tools than his hearing. And now I understand that I'm the tool that needed upgrading, not the equipment. He managed a weak smile. Ma'am, I heard you taught at Fort Moore, that you told the officers there about your failure in Kandahar. Hannah's chest tightened. Word travels. In the army always. He took a breath. Thank you for that, for being honest about making mistakes. It made my failure feel less like the end of the world and more like part of learning. It is part of learning, Chief. The question is whether you let it break you or teach you. I'm choosing taught, ma'am. I'm choosing to be better. He pulled out his phone, showed her a photograph. This is Specialist Morrison. She's in my new training group. She's been a mechanic for 3 years, and she knew the answer to a hydraulic problem I was stuck on. I almost dismissed her suggestion because she's 22, and I'm a warrant officer with 12 years in service. But you didn't dismiss her. No, ma'am. I listened, and she was right, and I thanked her in front of the entire team. His voice got quiet. I keep thinking about what you said, about assumptions killing soldiers, about expertise not looking one way. I'm trying to unlearn a dozen years of bad habits. That's all anyone can do, Chief. Try. And forgive yourself when you fail. They talked for another hour about maintenance philosophy, about the balance between technology and intuition, about how to teach soldiers to trust themselves without becoming arrogant. When they finally parted ways, Davis shook her hand with something that looked like genuine respect instead of the desperate gratitude of someone drowning. Ma'am, whatever you're doing, teaching, consulting, just existing, please keep doing it. The Army needs people like you more than it knows. Hannah drove home feeling slightly less hollow than she had in years. The apartment was still empty. The walls were still beige. The silence was still suffocating. But something had shifted. Some weight had redistributed itself into a shape she could almost carry. The flight to Colorado was early morning, the kind that required waking up at 0400 and feeling half dead through security. Hannah dozed on the plane, jerking awake every 20 minutes with the sense that she'd forgotten something critical. When she landed at Colorado Springs, a staff sergeant was waiting with her name on a tablet and a van that smelled like diesel and air freshener. Ma'am, Colonel Martinez sends her compliments. She's currently in a command briefing, but she'll meet you at the maintenance bay in 90 minutes. The drive to Fort Carson took them through mountain country that made Hannah's Texas flat soul ache with something like homesickness for places she'd never lived. The Sergeant Taylor, according to his name tape, kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror like he wanted to say something, but couldn't figure out how to start. Finally, he just asked, "Ma'am, is it true you fixed a tank in 90 seconds with just a mallet?" Hannah almost laughed. The story gets more dramatic every time someone tells it. I fixed a sensor issue that took about 3 minutes. The mallet was just part of the process. Still, ma'am, that's impressive. He paused. We've got a situation here that's kind of similar. New diagnostic systems that are supposed to make everything easier, but they're making the senior mechanics feel obsolete. The young soldiers trust the computers. The old-timers trust their hands. And Colonel Martinez is caught in the middle trying to make both sides work together. Which side are you on, Sergeant? Honestly, ma'am, I don't know. I've been in for 8 years. I learned on the old systems, but I'm comfortable with the new ones. I can see both perspectives. He merged onto the highway. But what worries me is that we're training soldiers who can read a screen but can't read a machine, and when the screen is wrong, which happens more than anyone wants to admit, they're helpless. That's exactly the problem. Can you fix it, ma'am? The question hung in the air between them. Hannah looked out the window at mountains that didn't care about human problems, at sky so blue it hurt to look at directly at a landscape that had watched armies come and go for centuries and would watch centuries more. I don't know if anyone can fix it, Sergeant, but maybe we can teach people to see it clearly. That's a start. The maintenance bay at Fort Carson was larger than the one at Fort Hood, more organized, cleaner. 3 Abrams tanks sat in various states of disassembly, surrounded by soldiers in grease-stained uniforms, and the kind of organized chaos that spoke to competent people doing difficult work. Hannah spotted Colonel Martinez immediately, a small woman with iron-gray hair, and the kind of command presence that made everyone in her vicinity straighten their posture without realizing it. Martinez saw her and walked over, hand extended. "Captain Lewis, thank you for coming on short notice." "It's just Hannah now, ma'am. I'm not active duty anymore." "Once a captain, always a captain, especially when you've earned it the way you did." Martinez's handshake was firm, brief, professional. "Let me be direct. I've got 2 master sergeants who've been maintaining armor for a combined 60 years. They're the best we have. But they're also resistant to the new computerized diagnostic systems because they think rightly, in some cases, that the systems are garbage." "Are they garbage?" "Sometimes. The systems are learning algorithms that get better over time. But right now, they're about 70% accurate on complex problems, which means 30% of the time they're confidently wrong." Martinez started walking toward the nearest tank. "My young soldiers trust the 70% and ignore the mechanics who know better. My old soldiers refuse to touch the computers and insist everything should be done by hand. The result is a maintenance pipeline that's slower, less efficient, and full of resentment on both sides." "What do you want from me?" "I want you to talk to my senior NCOs. Show them that someone who understands both approaches, someone they'll respect, believes the new systems have value when used correctly. Then I want you to talk to my young soldiers and scare them straight about blind faith in computers." She stopped walking. "Essentially, I want you to be a translator. Make both sides understand they need each other." Hannah looked at the tanks, at the soldiers working on them, at the sophisticated diagnostic equipment sitting next to toolboxes that looked older than she was. "Ma'am, with respect, what makes you think they'll listen to me?" "Because you're Captain Hannah Lewis, and you've already proven that expertise matters more than technology. Because you've walked both paths. Because you speak their language." Martinez's voice softened slightly. "And because I heard what you told the officers at Fort Moore, about failure, about Danny Ortega, about the cost of not trusting yourself. My senior NCOs need to hear that story from someone who lived it." Hannah's stomach dropped. "Ma'am, I'm not sure. I'm not asking you to bleed for them again, Captain. I'm asking you to show them that the Army still values their expertise, that new systems don't erase old wisdom, that technology is a tool, not a replacement." Martinez met her eyes directly. "These are good soldiers. They're just scared they're being made obsolete. You can show them they're wrong." Before Hannah could respond, a voice bellowed across the maintenance bay. "Colonel, we've got a problem with Tank 7. The diagnostic system says the transmission is fine, but she's grinding gears like a teenager learning to drive stick." Martinez's expression didn't change, but Hannah saw the tension in her shoulders. "Master Sergeant Chen, come meet our guest." The man who approached was in his mid-50s, built like a fire hydrant, with hands that were more scar tissue than skin, and eyes that had seen every possible way a machine could break. He looked at Hannah with the particular skepticism mechanics reserved for officers they hadn't worked with before. "Master Sergeant, this is Captain Hannah Lewis, former commander of Crazy Horse Company 3rd ACR. Chen's skepticism vanished instantly, replaced by something like shock. "Holy hell, you're the Ramadi captain, the one who jury-rigged the actuator with battery cables." It was commo wire, Master Sergeant, and it was more luck than skill. "Ma'am, with respect, that's bullshit. I read the after-action report. You diagnosed a hydraulic failure in the middle of a firefight and improvised a mechanical bypass using materials you had on hand. That's not luck, that's expertise." He glanced at Martinez. "Ma'am, why is Captain Lewis here?" "She's here to help us solve our technology versus experience problem." Chen's expression went carefully neutral. "The computer problem, you mean?" "The integration problem," Martinez corrected. "Chen, you're the best armor mechanic in this brigade, but you refuse to touch the new diagnostic systems. Why? Because they're wrong 30% of the time, ma'am. and that 30% gets people killed. But they're right 70% of the time, Martinez countered, which makes the job faster and more efficient when used correctly. Faster doesn't matter if it's wrong, ma'am. Hannah watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't about stubbornness or resistance to change. This was about fear. Chen had spent his entire career building expertise that he could trust absolutely. And now the army was telling him to trust something that failed 3 times out of 10. Master Sergeant, Hannah said quietly, what's wrong with Tank 7? Chen turned to her, grateful for the subject change. Transmission slipping between 2nd and 3rd gear started 2 days ago. I checked the fluid levels, inspected the physical linkages, tested the pressure systems. Everything looks good by hand, but the diagnostic computer says all systems are green, so my commander won't authorize a depot-level inspection. What do you think is wrong? I think there's a hairline fracture in the torque converter housing. Too small for the sensors to detect, but large enough to cause intermittent failures under load. He crossed his arms. But I can't prove it without pulling the entire transmission, which is a 40-hour job. And I can't get authorization for a 40-hour job when the computer says nothing's wrong. Hannah walked over to Tank 7, climbed up without asking permission. Chen followed her, and she could feel him watching her every move with the intensity of a master evaluating a student. She leaned into the engine compartment, not looking at anything specific, just listening. The idle was smooth. No unusual vibrations. No obvious sounds of mechanical distress. But there was a subtle wrongness in the frequency of the transmission's hum, like a singer slightly off pitch. Master Sergeant, start her up and cycle through the gears. Slowly. Chen dropped into the driver's position. The turbine spooled up with its familiar whine. He engaged the transmission. 1st gear was smooth. 2nd gear was smooth. The transition to 3rd produced a sound that lasted maybe half a second, a faint grinding that was almost below the threshold of hearing. Hannah closed her eyes and listened to it again. And again. On the 4th repetition, she heard what Chen had heard. The torque converter was flexing under load, not failing, not yet, but stressed in a way that would eventually catastrophically fail at the worst possible moment. She climbed down. You're right, Master Sergeant. The torque converter housing has a stress fracture. The diagnostic system can't see it because the fracture only opens under rotational load and the sensors measure static pressure. By the time the computer recognizes the problem, you'll have metal shavings through the entire transmission system. Chen's face went through several emotions simultaneously, vindication, relief, and renewed frustration. So, what do I do, ma'am? My commander won't authorize the repair without computer verification. Hannah turned to Martinez. Ma'am, permission to speak to Tank 7's crew commander. Granted. Lieutenant Morrison is over by the parts cage. Lieutenant Morrison turned out to be a freshly minted armor officer who looked about 12 years old and carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who'd never been catastrophically wrong about anything. He approached when Martinez called him over, his expression polite but puzzled. Lieutenant, I understand your tank has a transmission issue that Master Sergeant Chen wants to repair, but you're declining authorization. Ma'am, the diagnostic system shows all green. There's no mechanical fault indicated. Master Sergeant Chen is an excellent mechanic, but I have to rely on objective data, not subjective assessment. The objective data is incomplete, Lieutenant. The sensors can't detect stress fractures in the torque converter housing. Then how do you know there's a stress fracture? Because I listened to the transmission cycle and I heard it. Morrison's expression shifted from polite to patronizing so fast Hannah almost missed the transition. Ma'am, with respect, hearing something doesn't constitute diagnostic evidence. The Army has invested millions in these systems, specifically so we don't rely on subjective assessments. Hannah felt Chen tense beside her, felt Martinez watching carefully to see how she'd handle this, felt the weight of every soldier in the maintenance bay who'd stopped working to listen to this conversation. Lieutenant, if you don't authorize this repair, your transmission will fail, probably within the next 100 operating hours. When it fails, you'll contaminate your entire transmission system with metal debris. The repair will go from 40 hours to 200 hours, and from $15,000 to $100,000. Your tank will be deadlined for 3 weeks minimum. That's speculation, ma'am. It's expertise, Lieutenant. There's a difference. I understand you have extensive experience, ma'am, but the Army has procedures for a reason. If I authorize every repair based on a mechanic's intuition, I'll spend my entire maintenance budget on unnecessary work. Hannah pulled out the challenge coin, held it up so Morrison could see it. This coin belonged to my platoon sergeant. He gave it to me when I took command. He told me that the difference between a good officer and a great officer is knowing when to trust the book and when to trust the people who've been doing the job longer than the book has existed. Morrison's expression didn't change. Ma'am, I appreciate the sentiment, but I have to follow regulations. The regulations say you're authorized to make judgment calls based on crew and mechanic assessment when diagnostic data is ambiguous or incomplete. The data is incomplete. Master Sergeant Chen is giving you his professional assessment. You're choosing to ignore both. I'm choosing to trust the system the Army gave me. Then you're choosing wrong. Hannah's voice got harder. And when your transmission fails in the field because it will fail, Lieutenant, I guarantee it you're going to remember this conversation. You're going to remember that Master Sergeant Chen tried to save you, and you dismissed him because the computer said you were right. And you're going to spend the rest of your career wondering how many other times you've been confidently wrong. Morrison's face flushed. Ma'am, I don't appreciate being lectured by someone who doesn't have command authority here. She's not lecturing you, Lieutenant. Colonel Martinez's voice cut through the bay like a blade. She's warning you, and you'd be wise to listen. Morrison straightened to attention. Ma'am, the diagnostic protocols are clear. The protocols are guidelines, not scripture. And right now you have two subject matter experts telling you there's a problem your computer can't see. You want to know what I'm going to put in your evaluation report if you're wrong? That you valued procedure over expertise, that you dismissed experienced input in favor of automated systems, that you cost the Army $100,000 because you were too proud to listen. Morrison's face went from red to white. Ma'am, I authorize the repair, Lieutenant, now. Yes, ma'am. As Morrison walked away to file the authorization, Chen let out a long breath. Thank you, Colonel, both of you. Martinez looked at Hannah. That's why you're here, Captain. To show officers like Morrison that the computer is a tool, not an oracle. And to show NCOs like Chen that having experts like you validate their expertise makes the fight worth fighting. Ma'am, I didn't do anything special. I just listened. That's exactly what makes it special, Martinez said. The fact that you think listening is ordinary shows how extraordinary you actually are. The next 3 hours were a blur of similar conversations. Martinez assembled her senior maintenance NCOs and had Hannah talk to them about the balance between technology and intuition, about how to advocate for their expertise without dismissing new tools, about the importance of teaching young soldiers to trust their hands as much as their screens. Then she gathered the younger soldiers and had Hannah explain what happened when you trusted computers blindly, when you dismissed experience, when you chose the comfortable certainty of data over the uncomfortable ambiguity of judgment. She told them about Danny, about the mission she should have refused, about the price of being right but not brave enough to act on it. Some of them looked uncomfortable, some looked shocked. But all of them listened with the intensity of people learning something they hadn't known they needed to know. During a break, Master Sergeant Chen pulled her aside. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you retire after everything you accomplished after being one of the best armor officers in the Army? Why walk away? Hannah looked at him for a long moment, trying to decide how honest to be. Finally, she just told the truth. Because I stopped trusting myself, Master Sergeant. Because I made a mistake that cost a soldier's life and I couldn't live with the possibility of making that mistake again, so I hid for 5 years, worked a quiet job, stayed invisible, tried to pretend I was someone else. And now I'm trying to figure out if being Captain Lewis again is worth the pain it costs to be her. She pulled out the challenge coin, showed it to him. This belonged to my platoon sergeant. He told me the coin was a reminder to be the officer my soldiers needed, not the officer I wanted to be. I've been trying to be neither for 5 years. Maybe it's time to try being both. Chen studied the coin, then met her eyes. Ma'am, speaking for soldiers who've never had the privilege of serving under you, we need officers like you. Officers who know that expertise matters, who will listen to us when we say the computer's wrong, who understand that machines lie and people usually don't. He paused. Whatever pain it costs you to be Captain Lewis, it's worth it to us, just so you know. Hannah's throat closed up. She couldn't speak, just nodded and tucked the coin away before her hands started shaking too badly to hold it. The day ended with a dinner in the officers' club, where Martinez presented Hannah to the brigade command team. Colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors who'd all heard the story, who all wanted to shake her hand and tell her how much the Army needed people like her. Hannah smiled and made appropriate noises and felt like a fraud the entire time. But when a female major, one of 3 women in a room of 30 officers, pulled her aside afterward and said, "Thank you for existing, ma'am, for showing us it's possible," Hannah felt something in her chest unlock for the second time in a week. "It's more than possible, Major. It's necessary. We need officers who look different, think different, bring different perspectives. The Army doesn't know that yet. Not really, but they will." The flight home the next morning was delayed by weather, giving Hannah 3 hours in the airport to process everything that had happened. She bought terrible coffee and sat in a plastic chair watching planes take off and land, feeling like she was waiting for something but not knowing what. Her phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Martinez. "You changed minds yesterday. Changed the way my NCOs see themselves. Changed the way my young officers think about expertise. Whatever you decide to do next, know that you made a difference here." Then another text from an unknown number. "Captain Lewis, this is Master Sergeant Chen. I wanted you to know we pulled Tank 7's transmission this morning. You were right. Stress fracture in the torque converter exactly where you said it would be. If we'd waited another week, it would have catastrophically failed. You saved my career and probably someone's life. Thank you." Then another, "Ma'am, this is Lieutenant Morrison. I owe you an apology. You were right and I was wrong, and I'll never make that mistake again. Thank you for the lesson. It was expensive for my pride, but worth it for my education." Then another, and another, and another. By the time Hannah's flight finally boarded, she had 17 new messages from soldiers she'd talked to, taught, challenged, or simply existed in front of for a few hours. Every single one of them said some version of the same thing: you mattered. You changed something. Thank you for showing us what we needed to see. Hannah sat in her window seat looking out at clouds that stretched forever and realized something that made her chest hurt and her eyes sting. She'd spent 5 years trying to stop being Captain Lewis, trying to be invisible, trying to convince herself that who she'd been didn't matter anymore. But these soldiers, these NCOs and lieutenants and mechanics and officers, they needed Captain Lewis. They needed someone who'd failed and survived it. Someone who'd been right when everyone said she was wrong. Someone who'd paid the price for expertise and kept going anyway. Danny would never be a teacher. Would never stand in front of a classroom and help students understand history. But maybe Hannah could do it for him. Could stand in front of soldiers and help them understand that expertise mattered, that instinct mattered, that being different wasn't a liability, but a strength. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how you honored the dead, by teaching the living what their deaths had cost you to learn. Hannah pulled out her phone and typed a message to Colonel Thorne, "Sir," about that teaching position. "I'm ready to talk about it. For real this time." His response came before her plane even took off. "Name your terms, Captain. The Army needs you. More than I think you realize." Hannah looked out the window as the plane began to taxi, watched the ground fall away, watched Colorado disappear beneath clouds. Felt like she was finally, after 5 years of running, heading somewhere that mattered. The challenge coin was warm in her pocket. Casey's voice echoed in her memory. "The hardest thing about being a good officer is accepting that you're never done failing. You just get better at learning from it." "I'm trying, Casey," she whispered to the window, to the sky, to the ghost of the man who'd taught her everything that mattered. "I'm finally trying." And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough. The terms Hannah named were simple part-time, no more than 2 days a week, complete autonomy over curriculum, and the absolute right to walk away if it stopped working. Colonel Thorne agreed to everything without negotiation, which told Hannah more about how desperate the Army was for what she offered than any recruiting pitch could have. The official title was senior technical advisor to the armor school, which sounded impressive and meant almost nothing. What it actually meant was that Hannah spent Tuesday and Wednesday of each week at Fort Moore, standing in front of officers and NCOs telling them uncomfortable truths about expertise and failure and the difference between following orders and doing right. The first month was brutal. Not because the teaching was hard. Teaching came naturally, like muscle memory she'd forgotten she had. It was brutal because every class forced her to tell Danny's story again, to relive Kandahar, to explain in clinical detail how her obedience had killed a soldier she'd promised to protect. After the fourth class, she found herself in her car in the parking lot, hands shaking so badly she couldn't turn the key. Her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Master Sergeant Reyes. "Ma'am, you okay? I saw you leave the classroom pretty fast." "I'm fine, Master Sergeant." "That's bullshit, and we both know it." His voice was gentle but unyielding. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I know what trauma looks like. And I know you're re-traumatizing yourself every time you teach that class." Hannah's vision blurred. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. "It's the only way to make them understand. They need to see the cost. They need to know that mistakes aren't abstract. They need to learn, ma'am. But you don't need to bleed for them twice a week. There are other ways to teach this." "Are there?" Her voice cracked. "Because I've tried teaching without the story and they don't get it. They nod and smile and then they go out and make the same mistakes because they don't understand what's at stake." "Then maybe the problem isn't your teaching. Maybe it's their listening." Reyes paused. "Ma'am, I'm going to say something that might piss you off, but I'm saying it anyway. Danny Ortega's death wasn't your fault. It was the fault of a captain who dismissed your expertise and a command structure that valued his comfort over your knowledge. You're carrying guilt that belongs to other people. I could have refused the mission and destroyed your career, and they would have run the mission anyway with someone else commanding your tank, someone who might not have kept the rest of the crew alive." His voice hardened. "Ma'am, you saved 3 soldiers that day. You kept your driver and gunner breathing while your tank burned. You made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. Stop punishing yourself for not being perfect." Hannah couldn't speak. The tears came hard and fast. 5 years of grief pouring out in an airport parking lot while a master sergeant she barely knew stayed on the line and just breathed with her until she could breathe again. "Thank you," she finally whispered. "Don't thank me. Just promise me you'll talk to someone, a therapist, a chaplain, someone who can help you process this properly instead of weaponizing your trauma as a teaching tool." "I'll think about it." "That's not a promise, ma'am." "It's all I've got right now, Master Sergeant." He sighed. "All right. But I'm checking on you next week, and the week after, and every week until you either get help or tell me to fuck off. You can't talk to an officer like that. You're not an officer anymore, ma'am. You're a person who needs someone to give a damn. So I'm giving a damn whether you like it or not." He hung up before she could respond. Hannah sat in her car for another 20 minutes, Reyes's words echoing in her head. Finally, she pulled up her phone and searched for veterans therapist near me, stared at the results for a long time, closed the browser without calling anyone. But the next week she opened it again, and the week after that, and on the 4th week she actually made an appointment. The therapist's name was Dr. Sarah Kim, and she was a former Army psychologist who specialized in combat trauma and moral injury. Their first session was awkward. Hannah spent 45 minutes explaining why she didn't need therapy, while Dr. Kim listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard it all before. "So you're teaching classes twice a week where you relive your most traumatic experience in front of strangers and you think this is sustainable?" Dr. Kim asked. "It's necessary." "Necessary for whom, the students or for you?" Hannah opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't know anymore." "That's honest. Let's start there." Over the next 3 months, Hannah learned that guilt was different from responsibility, that surviving when others died wasn't a moral failure, that carrying Danny's memory didn't require carrying his death as punishment. Dr. Kim was relentless and kind, in equal measure pushing Hannah to distinguish between honoring the dead and being destroyed by them. "You can teach without bleeding," Dr. Kim said in their 8th session. "You can share Danny's story without making it a crucifixion. The students need to learn. You don't need to die for them to understand. But if I don't make them feel it, they'll feel it anyway, because you're an excellent teacher and your students respect you. You don't need to perform your trauma to earn their attention." Hannah started modifying her teaching approach, still honest about failure, still clear about consequences, but less willing to rip herself open twice a week for the education of strangers. The classes remained intense, but Hannah walked away from them intact instead of shattered. And something unexpected happened. The students responded better. They asked deeper questions, engaged more thoughtfully, stopped treating her pain as entertainment and started treating her experience as education. Chief Davis became a regular presence at her classes, sitting in the back row, taking notes, occasionally offering his own perspective on learning from failure. 6 months after their first encounter, he approached her after class with a shy smile. "Ma'am, I got accepted to the Warrant Officer Advanced course. I'm going to be teaching maintenance doctrine to the next generation of techs." "That's wonderful, Chief. You'll be good at it." "I hope so, but I wanted to ask..." He hesitated. "Would you be willing to guest lecture in my course? Talk about the balance between technology and intuition. I think my students need to hear it from you." Hannah's first instinct was to say no, to protect her boundaries, her energy, her limited capacity for emotional labor. But she looked at Davis and saw not the arrogant warrant officer from the motor pool, but a soldier who'd learned humility the hard way and wanted to pass that learning forward. "1 lecture per course cycle," she said, "and only if you promise to tell them your side of the story too. They need to hear from someone who failed and rebuilt themselves." His eyes widened. "Ma'am, I can't..." "You can and you will. If I'm going to bleed for them, you're going to show them what healing looks like." He stood straighter. "Yes, ma'am." The guest lecture happened 2 months later. Davis told his story first, how he'd dismissed Hannah, how his pride had nearly cost him everything, how he'd learned that expertise wore many faces and none of them matched his assumptions. Then Hannah told hers. Not the full trauma version, but the educational version Dr. Kim had helped her develop. Clear, honest, bounded. Afterward, a young warrant officer approached them. "Ma'am, Chief, thank you for that. For being honest about screwing up. Every instructor we have tells us about their successes. Nobody tells us about their failures. We need to hear about the failures." Hannah and Davis exchanged glances. Davis spoke first. "Why do you think that is? Why doesn't anyone teach failure?" "Because failure is shameful, Chief. Because we're supposed to be perfect. Because admitting mistakes makes us look weak." "That's exactly wrong," Hannah said. "Pretending to be perfect makes you weak. Admitting mistakes and learning from them makes you strong. The officers and NCOs who scare me aren't the ones who failed. They're the ones who think they haven't." The warrant officer looked between them. "So how do we get better at failing?" Davis laughed. "By doing it a lot and surviving it, apparently. And by talking about it," Hannah added. "By creating spaces where failure isn't shameful but educational. Where soldiers can say, 'I screwed this up,' without fearing it'll destroy their careers." "Does that space exist in the Army?" Hannah and Davis both paused. Finally, Hannah said, "Not yet, but maybe we can build it." That conversation led to something neither of them had planned. Davis proposed creating a monthly forum at Fort Moore called Lessons from Failure, where soldiers of any rank could share mistakes they'd made, lessons they'd learned, and wisdom they'd gained from screwing up. Hannah agreed to moderate if Davis would co-facilitate. Colonel Thorne approved it immediately. "If this works, we're expanding it Army-wide. The culture of false perfection is killing us. We need soldiers who can fail safely." The first forum drew 23 people, the second drew 60. By the 6th month, they had to move to a larger room to accommodate the 100-plus soldiers who wanted to attend. Officers and NCOs stood up and talked about maintenance mistakes, tactical errors, leadership failures. Each story ended the same way. "Here's what I learned. Here's what I'll do differently." Hannah watched it grow with something like awe. This was the thing Danny had wanted to do, teach soldiers that their mistakes were valuable, that history mattered because it taught you how to avoid repeating its horrors. She wasn't Danny, could never be Danny. But maybe this was how she honored his memory, not by dying for it, but by living for it. 9 months into her teaching position, Hannah got a call from a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, a woman's voice said, "Captain Lewis. This is General Patricia Hawthorne, Commanding General of Army Materiel Command." Hannah almost dropped the phone. "Ma'am, Yes, this is Hannah Lewis. Captain, I've been following your work at Fort Moore, the teaching, the forum, the cultural changes you're implementing. I want to bring you to AMC headquarters and have you design a program we can implement across the entire maintenance community." "General, I'm not sure I'm qualified." "You've changed the culture at one of the Army's premier training installations in less than a year. You've created measurable improvements in how soldiers think about expertise and failure. You've done what dozens of official programs have failed to accomplish." Hawthorne's voice was firm. "I need you at AMC, full-time position, senior executive service level, complete authority to design and implement whatever program you think we need." Hannah's chest tightened. "Ma'am, I left the Army because I couldn't trust myself anymore. I'm not sure I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person because you understand the cost of failure. Because you're not asking soldiers to be perfect, you're teaching them to be honest. That's what we need." A pause. "Captain, I know what happened in Kandahar. I read the classified after-action report. And I know that the captain who dismissed your warning went on to make similar mistakes that got 2 more soldiers killed before he was finally relieved of command. Your instinct was right. Your courage failed you for one moment, and you've spent 5 years punishing yourself for being human." Hannah couldn't speak. "Come to AMC. Help me fix the systemic issues that made your failure possible. Help me create an army where junior officers feel empowered to question senior ones when lives are at stake. Help me build the culture Danny Ortega would want to see." Hawthorne's voice softened. "You can't bring him back. But you can make sure his death teaches us something beyond your personal guilt." "I need to think about it, ma'am. Take 2 weeks, but Hannah, the Army needs you, not the perfect version of you, the real version. The one who failed and survived and learned to teach through the scars." The call ended. Hannah sat in her apartment staring at nothing, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet again. Full-time, Army Materiel Command, Senior Executive Service. It was everything she'd walked away from 5 years ago, offered back with complete knowledge of why she'd left. She called Dr. Kim. "I need an emergency session." They talked for 2 hours. About fear and opportunity, and whether Hannah was running toward something or away from something. About whether she could do this work without destroying herself. About whether healing meant protecting yourself from pain or learning to carry it without collapsing. "What scares you most about this job?" Dr. Kim asked. "That I'll fail again, that I'll give advice that gets someone killed, that I'll be wrong when it matters most. And what excites you most?" Hannah thought about that, about the forum at Fort Moore, about Lieutenant Hawkins and Chief Davis and Master Sergeant Chen and all the soldiers who'd told her that her existence mattered, about the possibility of changing not just individual soldiers, but the entire system that had made her failure inevitable. The idea that maybe I can prevent the next Hannah Lewis from making my mistakes. That maybe I can create an army where junior officers like I was feel safe saying this is wrong, even when senior officers like that captain say shut up and follow orders. That sounds like a reason to say yes. It sounds like hubris. It sounds like purpose. Dr. Kim leaned forward. "Hannah, you've spent 5 years punishing yourself for not being brave enough in one moment. Here's an entire career's worth of moments where you can be brave. The question isn't whether you're qualified. The question is whether you're willing." Hannah thought about Danny, about Casey, about Desert Rose and all the other tanks she'd commanded, about the challenge coin that still lived in her pocket, warm and worn and real. "I'm willing," she whispered. She called General Hawthorne the next day and accepted the position. The transition took 3 months. Hannah had to resign from her contractor job, relocate to Alabama, where AMC headquarters was based, and undergo the security clearance process for senior executive service. Colonel Thorne threw her a farewell event at Fort Moore that was supposed to be a small gathering, and turned into 200 soldiers showing up to thank her for changing how they thought about their jobs. Lieutenant Hawkins, now a first lieutenant commanding her own tank platoon, stood up and spoke. "Ma'am, before you came to Fort Moore, I was considering leaving the Army. I was tired of fighting. Tired of being the woman who had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. Tired of wondering if I belonged." Her voice strengthened. "You showed me that I do belong. That expertise matters more than expectations. That being different isn't a liability but an asset. I'm staying in the Army because you proved it was possible." Chief Davis spoke next. "Ma'am, you saved my career by destroying my pride. You taught me that being wrong isn't failure, refusing to learn is failure. Everything good I do from here forward, I owe to the lesson you taught me at that motor pool." Master Sergeant Reyes was last. "Ma'am, you're the finest officer I've never served under. You took your worst moment and turned it into everyone else's best lesson. That's not just good teaching, that's courage." Hannah tried to speak and couldn't, just nodded and wiped her eyes and felt the weight of their words settle into the places where guilt had lived for 5 years. She started at AMC the following Monday. Her office was small and functional. Her title was impressive but meaningless, and her mission was impossible. Change how the Army thought about expertise, failure, and the relationship between technology and human judgment. She spent the first month interviewing soldiers across the maintenance community, mechanics and officers and warrant officers and senior NCOs. Everyone had the same story in different words. The Army was teaching them to trust computers over instinct procedure, over judgment, and the result was slower repairs, more expensive mistakes, and a workforce that felt increasingly obsolete. "We're not trusted anymore," one master sergeant told her. "The young soldiers look at us like we're dinosaurs. They think the computer knows better than we do." "And sometimes it does," a young specialist countered. "The old-timers refuse to learn the new systems. They want everything done the way it was 20 years ago." Hannah listened to both sides and heard the same problem expressed differently. The Army had created a false choice between technology and expertise, between new methods and old wisdom. The solution wasn't to choose sides, but to integrate them. She designed a program called Hybrid Diagnosis Protocol, a system that required both computer analysis and human verification for any major repair decision. Soldiers had to run the diagnostic, then physically inspect the suspected failure point, then consult with senior mechanics before authorizing work. It was slower, more labor-intensive, but it was also more accurate and created built-in teaching moments where young soldiers learned from experienced ones. The first pilot program ran at Fort Hood, appropriately given where Hannah's return had started. Chief Davis was one of the instructors. Master Sergeant Chen from Fort Carson flew in to consult. They trained 20 maintenance teams on the new protocol. The results were immediate and dramatic. Diagnostic accuracy improved by 40%. Repair times dropped by 25% because they were fixing actual problems instead of chasing ghost errors. And most importantly, young soldiers reported feeling more confident because they had mentors guiding them instead of computers dictating to them. General Hawthorne approved expansion to every armor maintenance facility in the Army. Hannah spent the next year traveling to bases across the country, training soldiers, refining the protocol, listening to feedback. She stood in front of thousands of soldiers and told Danny's story thousands of times. Each telling hurt less, not because the pain diminished, but because its purpose grew clearer. She was teaching what Danny would have taught. She was building the Army he would have wanted to serve in. She was making his death mean something beyond her personal grief. On the 1-year anniversary of accepting the AMC position, Hannah found herself back at Fort Hood. Colonel Thorne had invited her for the commissioning ceremony of a new class of armor officers. Lieutenant Hawkins was there too now, commanding a company. Captain Hawkins, following the exact path Hannah had walked years before. After the ceremony, they stood together, watching the new second lieutenants celebrate with their families. Hawkins spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I wanted to tell you something. Last month, my battalion commander gave me an order I thought was wrong. A maintenance decision that my senior mechanic said was dangerous, and She paused. "I refused the order, ma'am. I told him I wouldn't execute it until we verified the repair was safe. He threatened to relieve me." Hannah's heart clenched. "What happened?" "I stood my ground. Cited the hybrid diagnosis protocol. Said I was following proper procedure, and if he wanted to overrule established safety measures, he needed to put it in writing." Hawkins smiled slightly. He backed down, and it turned out the mechanic was right. The repair would have catastrophically failed. My commander apologized afterward. Said I'd shown good judgment. That took courage, Captain. It took your example, ma'am. If you hadn't shown me that being right was more important than being obedient, I would have followed that order, and soldiers might have died. Hawkins met her eyes. "So thank you for being brave enough to teach us what your failure cost you to learn." Hannah pulled out the challenge coin. She'd carried it every day for 6 years through retirement and returned through trauma and healing through failure and redemption. She looked at it for a long moment, then held it out to Hawkins. "This belonged to my platoon sergeant. He gave it to me when I took command. It's supposed to remind you to be the officer your soldiers need, not the officer you want to be." Hawkins's eyes widened. "Ma'am, I can't." "You can and you will, because you just did what I couldn't do 6 years ago. You refused a bad order and saved lives. That's exactly the kind of officer this coin was meant for." Hannah pressed it into her hand. "Carry it. When things get hard, when you're tempted to choose your career over your soldiers, hold it and remember that courage matters more than comfort." Hawkins closed her fingers around the coin. "Ma'am, what will you carry?" Hannah thought about that, about Danny and Casey and Desert Rose and all the weight she'd carried for so long, about the guilt she'd weaponized into teaching and the healing she'd found in helping others. "I'll carry the lessons," she said. "I'll carry the responsibility. I'll carry the mission forward. That's enough." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Hawkins asked, "Ma'am, do you think Danny would be proud of what you've built?" Hannah's throat tightened. She thought about the eager young loader who'd wanted to teach history, who'd believed that mistakes were valuable, who'd died because Hannah hadn't been brave enough to trust herself. "I think he'd say I took too long to start, that I wasted 5 years hiding when I should have been teaching." She smiled through tears. "But yeah, I think he'd be proud. I think he'd say I finally figured out how to honor his memory by living forward instead of drowning backward." 6 months later, Hannah stood in the Pentagon briefing a room full of generals on the results of the hybrid diagnosis protocol. The data was overwhelming. Improved accuracy, faster repairs, better retention of experienced mechanics, higher confidence among junior soldiers. The program had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. General Hawthorne stood up when Hannah finished. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is a fundamental cultural shift. We're teaching soldiers to trust their judgment again, to value experience alongside technology, to understand that expertise doesn't always come from a computer screen." She turned to Hannah. "Ms. Lewis has accomplished in 18 months what dozens of programs have failed to accomplish in decades. She's changed how we think about maintenance, about expertise, about the relationship between soldier and machine." The Chief of Staff of the Army, a 4-star general, Hannah had never met, spoke next. "Ms. Lewis, I'm authorizing expansion of this protocol beyond maintenance. I want you to design similar programs for operations, logistics, and intelligence. I want this philosophy embedded across the force." Hannah stood there feeling the weight of that mission settle onto her shoulders. It was enormous, impossible, exactly the kind of challenge that would consume years of her life and require everything she had to give. "Sir, I'll need a team. People who understand both sides, the technology and the human element. People who failed and learned from it." "Name your team. You'll have whatever resources you need." I want Chief Warrant Officer Davis as my Deputy Director of Training, Master Sergeant Chen as Senior Technical Consultant, and I want Captain Jessica Hawkins as my military liaison. They've all walked the path from arrogance to humility. They know what we're trying to teach. Approved. All of them. Hannah left the Pentagon that evening feeling something she hadn't felt in 7 years' purpose. Not the haunted, trauma-driven purpose that had sent her into hiding. Real purpose. The kind that built futures instead of dwelling in past failures. She drove to Arlington National Cemetery. It was nearly closing time, but she knew where she was going, and the guards recognized her. Now she came every month without fail. She walked between the white headstones until she found the section where the fallen from Operation Enduring Freedom were laid to rest. Danny Ortega's headstone was simple like all the others. Just his name, his rank, his dates. But someone, probably his family, possibly former members of Crazy Horse Company, had left fresh flowers. They did that every week without fail. Hannah had met them once, told them she was sorry, listened to them say it wasn't her fault. She didn't believe them yet, might never believe them, but she was learning to carry the guilt without letting it destroy her. "Hey, Danny," she said quietly, kneeling in front of the stone. "I've been busy. Building that thing you wanted to build, teaching soldiers that mistakes matter, that history matters, that we can learn from failure without being destroyed by it." A breeze rustled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler was playing taps for another soldier being laid to rest. "I gave away Casey's coin today, to an officer who's braver than I was, who refused a bad order and saved lives. I think you'd like her. She wants to change the Army from the inside, make it better for the next generation." Hannah smiled despite the tears. "Kind of like what you wanted to do, actually." She stood up, brushed dirt from her knees. "I'm not asking for forgiveness anymore, Danny. I don't think I deserve it, and I don't think you can give it. But I'm asking for something else. I'm asking that your death keeps mattering. That every soldier I teach, every protocol I design, every culture shift I help create, I'm asking that it all counts as honoring your memory. That's the best I can do." The breeze picked up. The flowers on his grave stirred slightly. Hannah walked back to her car feeling lighter than she had in years. Not healed. Healing was an ongoing process, not a destination, but whole enough to keep going. Whole enough to do the work. Whole enough to be Captain Hannah Lewis again without it destroying her. She drove home as the sun set, the Pentagon glowing in her rearview mirror, the future spreading out before her like territory waiting to be explored. She thought about all the soldiers she'd teach, all the lives she'd touch, all the failures she'd help people survive. She thought about Danny, teaching history to students he'd never meet. About Casey teaching mechanics to soldiers he'd never know. About how the dead lived on in the lessons they left behind and the people brave enough to carry those lessons forward. And she thought about Desert Rose still serving somewhere, still roaring when asked, still teaching young tank commanders that machines and people needed each other, that technology without judgment was dangerous, and judgment without technology was blind. The best wisdom lived in the integration of both. Hannah Lewis had spent 15 years learning that lesson in fire and blood. Had spent 5 years hiding from it. And now she'd spend however many years remain teaching it to everyone who'd listen. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything Danny's death and Casey's wisdom and her own hard-earned survival had taught her was possible. She'd been broken, and she'd rebuilt herself. She'd failed, and she'd learned. She'd hidden, and she'd returned. And now she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, teaching exactly what the Army needed to learn. Some officers led from the front. Some led from the middle. Hannah Lewis led from her scars, and she taught an entire generation of soldiers that surviving failure with wisdom intact was the truest form of courage the Army would ever need.